Latest news of the Gulf War, we go over to the newsroom and Martyn Lewis.
Further Allied air attacks are underway on the second night of Desert Storm, the operation to force Iraq out of Kuwait. RAF Tornado aircraft have taken off again from bases in Saudi Arabia, flying to strategic targets in Iraq and Kuwait. 3 Allied aircraft, 1 British, 1 American and 1 Kuwaiti, did not return from last night's sorties. The Iraqis are claiming that Allied casualties are much higher, but the Pentagon has dismissed that as ridiculous exaggeration. During the day, Allied ground forces began taking up new positions closer to the Kuwaiti border. President Bush has said the Allied attack against Iraq will continue until Saddam Hussein withdraws from Kuwait. He said he's pleased with the way the Allied operation is going. In a broadcast tonight to the nation, the Prime Minister, John Major, said the Allies were simply doing what the United Nations said should be done. He added, the military action will continue until Saddam Hussein comes to his senses. But the Iraqi leader has remained defiant. He repeated his call for a holy war against what he called the forces of Satan.
It's almost exactly 24 hours since Operation Desert Storm began, and there's no sign of a let-up in the intense air attacks being carried out by Allied forces. In the next few hours, it's expected that the number of sorties against targets in Iraq and Kuwait will soon pass 2,000. The first mission began shortly before midnight last night. American, British, Saudi and Kuwaiti bombers and fighter planes came out of the darkness of the desert to launch the biggest attack of its kind since World War II. Its sheer size and ferocity is said to have caught the Iraqis by surprise. By the first light of dawn, as the RAF Tornadoes returned to their desert bases, it was clear the waves of attacks had been successful.
Absolutely terrifying. There's no word for it. You're frightened of failure, you're frightened of dying. Oh, it's everything. You're flying as low as you dare, high enough to get the weapons off, but you push it as low as you can over the target just to get away as fast as you can.
Well, they've come back, they've reported the firing of missiles, explosions, lots of ground fire coming from Kuwait. They've been able to see that from the air. It was obviously a very busy night in Kuwait.
Eyewitnesses told how they kept under cover as bombs rained down from the sky.
Since morning we had 3 attacks, air attacks on an area near the airport where there's a big Kuwaiti army camp that had been, that is used by the Iraqi now. And it had, in that area there's also a military hospital. And according to some eyewitness from the hospitals inside Kuwait City, that some injured had been moved into those hospitals.
The Pentagon says so far it's satisfied with how Operation Desert Storm has gone.
As far as the coalition is concerned, and as far as my orders from the President are concerned, we've been instructed to execute the plan, to carry on these operations until we have achieved our objective. Our objective is to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait.
But the President, George Bush, warned against any complacency.
I will not be commenting on the ups and downs, there will be some downs, or the trauma of the moment. There's a lot of trauma at the moment. But I think it is fair to say, and I will be repeating this to the leaders here, that we are pleased with the way things have gone so far. We are determined to finish what we've set out to do.
Iraqi TV has been broadcasting pictures of Saddam Hussein. When they were recorded isn't clear, but he has been putting out defiant messages throughout the day. The relentless Allied attacks that have been intensified are expected to continue through the night and possibly go on for some days to come.
And the Reuters news agency is quoting America's cable news network as saying that B-52 bombers, the high-altitude bombers, are carpet bombing Iraqi positions and have been doing so since early this morning. One of the network's correspondents in Saudi Arabia said the long-range bombers, which are the heaviest in the Allies' arsenal, were flying missions from Turkey and from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. We will have a full news bulletin at midnight, but if there are any major developments, we will, of course, bring them to you straight away. In the meantime, over to David Dimbleby with a special program of comment and reaction to the events of the last 24 hours.
Good evening. The reports which have been coming in all day suggest an astonishingly successful first 24 hours of bombardment by Allied forces in this operation appropriately called Desert Storm, with minimum casualties to our own forces, and it seems at present, at any rate, no major civilian casualties reported from Iraq. Now, in this special program this evening with my guests here, I'm going to be discussing some of the issues that are going to arise if this success continues the way it is, what the problems will be, so to speak, of the peace. We'll be talking about how the operation can ensure Saddam's abandonment of Kuwait, what chance there is of surrender by him or perhaps by his troops, whether the Arab members of the coalition are going to stick with it if they begin to feel, perhaps Saddam sticking firm, that the Arab nations as a whole are in danger of being humiliated by the West, and what the United Nations and the Allies should be thinking about as they face the task of turning what may be a spectacular victory into a lasting peace. We begin with reaction to today's event from inside the War Cabinet here in Britain. I spoke earlier today to Defence Secretary Tom King. Mr. King, did you expect in your wildest dreams that the first 24 hours of this engagement would go with so little damage done to our own forces?
No, because we did obviously hope to achieve what surprise we could, but it was very difficult to see whether we would be effective in that way. And certainly I think it says a lot for the skill and the quality of some of the equipment used that we were able to do as much as we did.
Do you believe it may be possible now to achieve the aims of the Allies without actually having to prosecute a war on the ground, a tank battle or an infantry battle to take Kuwait?
I don't believe that on the evidence of what's happened today. I'm a bit worried tonight that because there have been some significant successes in the first virtually 24 hours, that some people are running away with the idea that it's all over. Iraq possesses very significant military capability. It has some very unpleasant weapons indeed. Everybody knows just how much of his resources Saddam Hussein has devoted to his military machine. And we could still be in for some nasty shocks. And I certainly hope that the progress we've made will continue. But I would certainly caution people against getting carried away at this stage.
If he has these nasty weapons that you talk about and have been generally described, isn't it curious that they weren't in use in the first 24 hours?
Well, I think they were taken by surprise, and I think they may have been taken aback by the scale of the attacks that they faced and by their accuracy. We were determined in making the air plan that we would inflict as much damage as we could on the military capability while protecting, as far as we possibly could, Iraq from civilian casualties. The evidence that I have so far, that looks as though that's been achieved with some quite remarkable effect. And we have certainly in things like their command and control arrangements, the communication side, had significant impact on their military capability. And perhaps because of some of the attacks there, and on perhaps also one or two of their missile sites, that may have inhibited some of their intentions.
I take it when you say that you believe this has been achieved without massive civilian casualties, you're not speaking lightly. You do actually know what has happened in the past 24 hours.
Well, I said on the evidence available to me, and we do know of some remarkably accurate strikes on military installations and defence buildings as well, and those were quite clearly military targets, and they seem to have been achieved with relatively little collateral damage. I have to say this, that our information isn't fully clear at the moment. We've had not the fullest pictures that we would want of the results, but at the moment my impressions, which I give as honestly as I can, are that it's very encouraging in that respect.
Do you anticipate publishing this as soon as possible? Because you'll be aware that the Iraqi ambassador, the ranking Iraqi ambassador as he's called in Europe, is saying there have been heavy civilian casualties. Now we know from what we've seen coming out of Baghdad today that they haven't produced any evidence of this up to now. There's been no film of that, but it is a claim that they're making. Do you intend to counter it by publishing satellite pictures that demonstrate the accuracy of the bombing in the next 24 hours or so?
Well, we will see what we can do. We haven't that material in a form that we could use at this stage, but and it's obviously something which the United States would want to give consideration to, as well as Saudi Arabia, who are closely coordinating this air campaign. But I think it must be significant that the journalists that are in Baghdad, I understand, now being prevented from broadcasting and from communicating. And with my experience, what I've seen of the Iraqi authorities, if they had any propaganda material of that kind that they could use to good effect, they would be very anxious to use it. And there is the suggestion, which, as I say, we believe may have some credence, that it is because they don't want them to see the accuracy of much of the attack in terms of the military installations.
Would you go along with what the French military leader, Schmidt, has said tonight? I don't know whether you've seen this report, but he has said that Iraq is, I quote, not able to send serious chemical attacks now, be they on Saudi Arabia or on Israel, because these launch sites have been neutralized.
Well, we think we have seen significant damage to certain of their chemical facilities, and that's true, very encouraging. But we're no doubt they may also have dispersed some of their weapons in this containing perhaps chemical warheads, and so I think it's a little early to draw that conclusion.
Am I to infer from that that we ought to be ready for some kind of surprise from Iraq over the next 24 hours, that it may be too easy to assume that if they were able to retaliate, they would have done so already, and that in fact there's a possibility of them holding back deliberately so that they can spring a surprise on us tomorrow?
Well, you can speculate on the reasons why certainly their response so far has been as relatively slight as it has been. I think the element of surprise, I think being taken aback by the scale and accuracy of the attack, I think perhaps also, as I said, the severance of some of their communications, which prevented orders that might have been for certain strike back take place, actually occurring. It may be also that with their limited resources that they decided to conserve these and, as it were, to try and sit out the first attacks. And what I'm really cautioning against is jumping to premature conclusions. I hear certain commentators talking as though they're practically all over and that it's a rational and logical outcome of superior technical equipment able to achieve this outcome. I think it's premature to reach those conclusions. All the advice that I'm receiving is that it's far too early to determine that, and there could still be serious strike backs, and that's why it's very important, and our forces, certainly in the Gulf, are staying very much on their guard against Iraqi counterattacks.
The aim of this military action, Desert Storm, is in part directly military, but of course it's also in part psychological, because if you could force Saddam Hussein to surrender, or if you could persuade the Iraqis or his close military compatriots to rise up against him, you would have achieved your result without having to go the whole way with the battle. Do you think there's any likelihood, and you must have studied the psychology of Saddam carefully before embarking on this or in the process of it, do you think there's any likelihood that he would surrender, or do you think it would be more in character for him to stay in his bunkers and hurl imprecations at the West?
Well, such studies has been possible to do of Saddam Hussein. I don't think you can base your campaign on that. In the end, we have to base it on the logic of military force. And what we've sought to do, and specifically the reason why the President and why we, at a moment, as you remember, in the build-up of this situation, reinforced our forces in the Gulf, was to provide that capability, that air capability as well as the land capability, that meant that we could really dominate the air battle. That's what we've sought to do, because what we want to do by the sheer scale of the air onslaught on the military capability and on his command control communications is to try and achieve the objectives of the liberation of Kuwait and the other United Nations resolutions with the minimum of casualties and in as short a space of time as possible. And that is the purpose of this campaign. And the ways in which psychologically he may react to that or not, I think are very difficult to predict. We try and rest on the sheer basis of military logic.
So your aim is not to demoralize Saddam or to demoralize the Iraqi people. It's actually to score the military victory of physically driving them out of Kuwait. That's your first aim.
Yes, it's to incapacitate that military capability and to demoralize the forces that are occupying Kuwait and the other forces that might be part of any counterattack against the multinational forces that will seek to liberate Kuwait. It's to provide a really effective military force and a really effective military campaign that can achieve those objectives.
Why has it apparently been ruled out both in Washington and in London today in response to many questions in the light of the efficacy of the first 24 hours bombing raids and the damage this is thought to have done to the morale of the Iraqi command? Why is a pause absolutely ruled out on both sides? Or is this also, in a way, a psychological approach to the business of liberating Kuwait?
Having just started on a campaign which is a very complicated but a very integrated matter, to bring an air campaign of this kind together, I take the illustration that some of our aircraft are involved in what's called airport denial. That's in dropping bombs that will blow craters in the runways and will make it, if possible, impossible for Iraqi aircraft to take off. Now, that damage can be repaired. And you completely negate the purpose of that exercise, which is to confine their aircraft to the ground and then seek to destroy them thereafter on the ground. If you suddenly have a pause in the middle of the campaign, which allows them to repair their runways, and you find you're facing once again the Iraqi Air Force again. And that's just a simple illustration of why you can't suddenly stop a campaign like this in the middle. The reality is that having now launched this air campaign, it would certainly need the most convincing proof that Saddam Hussein had now accepted the obligation to withdraw from Kuwait and to observe the United Nations resolutions. We'd need very convincing evidence of that indeed, if after this conflict, so unfortunately, starting as it is and we're involved in now, we wouldn't stop it halfway.
So it's hard pounding now until Kuwait is free?
That's how I see it.
Mr. King, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tom King, who I spoke to earlier this evening. So hard pounding is the government's view of this. Sir Crispin Tickell was British ambassador to the United Nations until the autumn of last year. Is there going to be, you know the UN well, is there a danger that if this hard pounding goes on and Saddam does nothing, that the Arab world as a whole is going to begin to feel that it's being humiliated by the West and may start to pull away from the coalition which has held this whole thing together under the aegis of the United Nations at the start of the operation?
But of course we start with a divided Arab world in the first place. And I think people rather neglect and perhaps don't want to hear that the Arabs are profoundly divided in their emotions about this whole affair. On the one hand, they feel that the Western countries have had all the advantages of science and technology, we lead comfortable lives and everything else, and they are the poor of the earth, and they're still recovering from the colonialism of the Turks, and then the colonialism of the British, and then the colonialism of anybody you care to mention. They feel this quite strongly. And on the other hand, they feel that they don't like Saddam Hussein. He's in a large, powerful country has invaded a weak neighbor, and for that reason they feel, as all people must on such occasions, that they must rally to an international cause. And they therefore feel, I think, very divided on this issue. And there is a risk that if we indulge in excessive, if we flatten the rubble and then flatten it again and then once again, they will feel indeed that the West is taking over once more as they've seen it in the past. And you have to strike a very careful balance. And perhaps the most dangerous part in our sort of presentation of the issue, of course, is Israel. And that is the most difficult thing for us all, because the Arabs don't forgive the United States, they don't forgive other Western countries for what has happened in Israel.
But we come to Israel in a moment, but just stick with that one point. How would you fight this war in such a way that you didn't appear to be humiliating the Arab world by showing Western dominance? Would you, for instance, argue what some people have raised for a pause at some point, a breathing space in which the United Nations says to President Saddam, you can see you're going to be defeated? Or do you accept what Tom King says, that that is actually impossible in this war? It would only give him a chance to regroup, and you've just got to go on until the bitter end.
I think that it would be unwise, for the reasons that Tom King has just given, for us to stop in the middle, because that gives so many military advantages to the person whom we've been giving months to reflect on this issue to come round, that I fear it would be extremely unwise to do that.
In that case, how do you satisfy the requirement that you've put, that the West shouldn't be seen to, so to speak, flatten Iraq and flatten it again and again, because that may be the only way of getting him to surrender.
I think we have to go for our military targets. We have to achieve what we have to achieve in military terms, and then we have all the time, and at the same time, always to say, we are ready to work out fresh arrangements with you once you have withdrawn from Kuwait and once we can start thinking about the future. I have the feeling that Saddam Hussein has not started thinking about the future. I think he's in a kind of apocalyptic mood. I mean, it is he who said recently to a friend of mine that he smelt the perfumes of paradise. And in a sense, that means that he's thinking about pulling down the pillars of the temple. So we're not dealing with a rational man, and giving him extra time to regroup does not seem to be very wise. So we have to go for the military targets, achieve what we want to achieve in military terms, while all the time making it clear that we are ready to talk to an Iraq, provided that Iraq withdraws from Kuwait.
Well, now, Air Vice Marshal Sir Michael Armitage, you're former head of Defence Intelligence, former head of the Royal College of Defence Studies. In your opinion, is there a way of conducting this war which will allow Iraq and the Arab world as a whole to feel that an injustice has not been done it, that the UN has come, and the Americans with the UN have come to the support of the whole Arab world as well as everybody else against the dictator? Or is it in fact militarily impossible to stop until you get the surrender and the withdrawal from Kuwait, and you may have to do things that politically you would regret having to do?
I very much agree with what the Secretary of State has just said. That is to say, we must now continue with this offensive operation, if only to take out his nuclear potential and his chemical warfare capabilities. But you asked Sir Crispin how we should fight the war, and the answer to that is, I think, the way that we're fighting it now. We're being extremely careful to avoid collateral damage, civilian casualties and that sort of thing. But even more, I think we've got to be very careful not to offend the Muslims by attacking or damaging, for example, the 4 major Shia shrines near Baghdad, or the 2 Sunni shrines which are near Baghdad. Any damage to those would cause all sorts of problems. There are places to which many hundreds of thousands of Muslim pilgrims go each year. And I think we've got to be very careful about our targeting, which, from what we see from the news, the Allied commanders are indeed being so far.
George Robertson, Labour's Foreign Affairs spokesman, perhaps just one thing you could clarify for me, because I'm not absolutely clear about it. Why didn't Labour continue with its opposition to force? It was made clear by Gerald Kaufman and Neil Kinnock that they wanted sanctions to last longer. Wouldn't the consistent position now to be sitting here saying we still think that and we don't actually support the use of force in these circumstances?
Well, I think there was a legitimate view in the American Congress as well that said that perhaps a greater period for sanctions might have perhaps produced less inflexibility on Saddam Hussein's side. But when the decision was taken, for the reasons best known to the 28 nations part of the coalition, I think at that stage the debate has to end on that count. And I think that we have to say that the next argument is the military victory that is involved. History will tell us whether we were right or we were wrong, but I think it's right and proper, and Neil Kinnock made it clear even when the policy was being articulated for more time, that if force was necessary, then we would support the use of force. And I think that's the only consistent way in which we can behave now.
And do you have any reservations about the scale of the force, or are you absolutely behind whatever Tom King and the Pentagon decide to do, in the light of what Sir Crispin was saying?
Well, I think putting it as Tom King and the Pentagon, there are a large number of armed forces involved here, and it is a UN target that we're talking about. It is a UN objective, and that is what the Labour Party has supported. Clearly, if what is being embarked upon now is a targeting, an aerial targeting of military targets, then that seems to be the most effective way of getting a short resolution of this conflict with the minimum of casualties, especially of civilian casualties, and that seems certainly at the moment to us to be the reasonable way of going about it.
Sir David Steele joins us from Edinburgh as Foreign Affairs spokesman of the Liberal Democrats. Sir David, if you look ahead a bit to what looks as though it may well be an Allied victory here, a lot of people are talking about the need for a Middle East peace conference. We're talking a moment perhaps about the need for trying to secure some arrangement between Israel and the Palestinians. There are a whole lot of problems in the Middle East. Do you think that there's a danger that the peace that follows the victory may be worse than the uneasy state of affairs before the war began?
No, I don't think so. But what I feel very determined about is that we must, while this military campaign is going on, also have a propaganda campaign. And I was very struck, and I've told anyone who will listen about this, last week when I was in Jordan and in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza, at the extent to which, very sadly, we have lost the propaganda war, and the extent to which both the Jordanians and the Palestinians were in support of Saddam Hussein, not because of his invasion of Kuwait, but because, it was, as it was put to me, he was at least arranging another throw of the dice to see whether something better might come out of it. Now, this is a very dangerous climate, and I think that that's why, although I don't support a pause in the military effort, and Tom King must be right about that, I do think that the UN Security Council, through this operation, must continue to keep up the propaganda front and say to the Arab world, to the coalitions, look, we don't want to keep up a bombardment of Iraq. Surely something should happen inside Iraq to get rid of Hussein and bring this thing to an end. And that must be kept up all the time.
Do you anticipate that the Security Council will be reconvened to consider the course of the war fairly soon, if this goes on for a day or two like this, and that it may need to have this argument and have a vote on the way that their own resolution is being prosecuted?
No, I don't think that's necessary. I mean, I think that under the existing Security Council resolutions, it would be enough for, say, the Secretary-General himself, or indeed for any of the leaders of the Allied coalition, simply to say at the appropriate time, when the military advises that the air defences of Iraq have been successfully wiped out, that a warning should be given that the next stage is unhappily going to be much bloodier, the land war, and that we don't particularly want this, and that there's still a chance for the Iraqis to change their mind and to bring the whole thing to an end. We must keep up the political pressure as well as the military pressure.
Now, Winston Churchill, Conservative MP on the House of Commons Defence Committee, do you think there's any chance of what David Steele was talking about, of persuading Iraq to give up before there is a bloody battle on the ground?
I do, but I think it will be above all by the process which is going on at the moment, with the B-52s dropping large tonnages of bombs on the Presidential Guard and the Iraqi army in the field. A single raid by B-52s represents 900 tons of bombs. It will be a colossal bombardment to which they will be subjected. After 2 or 3 days, they might well conclude they've had enough of it.
And might we see the Iraqi army surrender without permission from the President, as we saw Egyptians surrendering to the Israelis in the war that you
I don't think
covered many
en
years
bloc,
ago?
but one could see this happening in different parts of the battlefield, or there is the alternative scenario that you might get senior commanders having a showdown with Saddam Hussein and pushing him aside.
Sir Crispin, let's just come back for a moment to this, the Arab aspect of this. In terms of Saddam himself and those countries that support him, is it likely that they will respond to the kind of force that we've seen by throwing in the towel, by giving up? Because all the indications that experts give on this is that it's very unlikely that he will, that for whatever reason he's going to sit tight.
I'm sure he's going to sit tight for the moment. I don't think there's much doubt about that. I think some of those in the Security Council who are always readier to will the end rather than to will the means will be knocking their knees and feeling very unhappy and maybe wanting a debate. And I wouldn't disagree with Sir David Steele that a debate might be useful at some point, although I doubt whether we should wish to have a vote. There's apparently every reason for having occasional reports to the Security Council. Indeed, I think it would be wise for the Americans, as the leader of the coalition, to make such a report. And I'm fairly sure they will make it. But for the Arab members of the Council and for the Arab members of the United Nations, they are, I'm no doubt, going through feelings of some anguish at what is going on.
But looking ahead, if you imagine an Iraq that has effectively been crushed because Saddam refuses to give up, and so the worst has happened, how can you see any kind of peace or stability being restored?
It's going to be a long and difficult process, and you have to really look at two quite different sets of hypotheses. One is that Saddam Hussein remains in his bunker, continuing to shout defiance while his country collapses in ruins around him, in which you've got one set of considerations, which I think is the more difficult one. And then the second one is that he surrenders, or he's killed, or he's replaced, and you can then start to negotiate with the new government of Iraq. Because, of course, our quarrel is not with the Iraqi people, but with Saddam Hussein. And so I'm afraid it depends very much on him, as it's depended on him throughout the whole crisis. And I wish I could think of an easier way to deal with the first hypothesis, which is the more difficult one.
Are we, well, perhaps I should raise this question when we come back, because we'll be coming back, but it is interesting, perhaps, that we may be seeing the beginning of a kind of Pax Americana, because one of the things that's perfectly clear today is that America is the only country now in the world, with support of our own forces, that has the technology actually to act as the world policeman if it so chooses, and under the aegis of the UN. But we'll come to that in a moment, because it's coming up to midnight, and we have a news bulletin, which we'll come to, and then we'll come back here afterwards. So we'd rejoin Martyn Lewis in the newsroom. Martyn.
The news at midnight, exactly 24 hours after the Allied forces went to war in the Gulf to free Kuwait. Yet another Allied air attack is underway, bombarding the intensely fortified Iraqi troop positions on the front line in Kuwait and key long-range targets deep in Iraq. The American cable news network is now reporting more anti-aircraft fire in Baghdad, and that the high-altitude B-52 bombers flying from bases in Turkey and the Indian Ocean military base of Diego Garcia are carpet-bombing Iraqi positions. The RAF has just said that all Tornado aircraft which took off from Dhahran Air Base today are back safely, and that includes the latest attacks. President Bush has said the attacks will go on until Iraq withdraws from Kuwait. He called on Saddam Hussein to surrender. The first missions began shortly before midnight our time, 3 a.m. in Iraq. American, British and Saudi bombers and fighters from air bases and carriers joined in a single concerted attack. First targets for the American bombers were Iraqi radar and air defense systems. The Israelis say Scud missiles targeted on them from western Iraq were among those knocked out by US planes. British ground attack Tornadoes flying from eastern Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and escorted by British and US fighters hit Iraqi airfields and defense systems. 100 Tomahawk cruise missiles with conventional warheads were launched from American ships in the Gulf and Red Sea, and according to BBC correspondents in Baghdad, hit military targets in the capital. And this as hundreds more American as well as Saudi bombers attacked strategic installations throughout Iraq and Kuwait. The Pentagon claimed 80% of targets destroyed. Daybreak saw no let-up. New targets were sought out. Some of those not destroyed overnight returned to. 3 Allied planes, 1 British, 1 American and 1 Kuwaiti, did not return from yesterday's operations. Our correspondent Brian Barron watched some of the planes leaving Dhahran Air Base in Saudi Arabia as the Allied offensive began.
This was a night and a day in which Iraq trembled under the hammer blows of Tomahawk cruise missiles never before fired in anger. These precision weapons of the 21st century, carrying conventional warheads, were fired at Iraq 300 miles away from the battleship Wisconsin in the Gulf. Baghdad's defense ministry was one of the targets that took direct hits. Onshore, in the darkness of the night, the American Air Force prepared what proved to be one of the greatest surprise attacks of modern warfare. For days they'd been tensely waiting while Saddam Hussein contemptuously rejected final peace moves. Just before the lethal aerial armada took off, the commander of the lead plane shrugged off all doubts.
We feel more than prepared. We feel very ready. We've been ready for 5 months now. It's a job that needs to be done, and we're prepared to do it.
Ahead lay the unknown capabilities of the Arab world's most powerful military machine, but the Americans seemed raring to go.
Hit them hard. Yes, sir. We'll kick your ass. Okay.
The mission of these Phantom F-4s was to knock out the Iraqis' surface-to-air missiles, the SAMs. Success would safeguard the low-flying bombers, such as RAF Tornadoes. So Operation Desert Storm started like this, with the unsuspecting Iraqis about 1 hour's flight away. Everyone in these American squadrons in Saudi Arabia had trained to perfection, but they dreaded the wait for the pilot's return from Baghdad and had a sensible respect for the opposition. But the mightiest air attack ever launched achieved stunning results. The pilots were back in 3 hours, having devastated much of Iraq's air power. Soon after dawn today, the Americans were rearming their planes prior to sending them back with fresh crews for Phase 2 of Operation Desert Storm. Those who'd been in the first wave showed satisfaction at crippling Iraq's command and control defense system.
biggest thing I saw was one of the most fantastic fireworks demonstrations I've seen since 4th of July party years and years and years ago. This was tremendous. Baghdad was lit up like a Christmas tree.
It's just like a football game, too. Once you get airborne and you get the jet under you and you start feeling good, then you just start working your game plan, and it's just like a game there. First couple of plays of a big football game, you settle down, you feel a lot better.
The language of Top Gun to describe an aerial juggernaut that even now is seeking out fresh Iraqi targets. But among the scores of thousands of American troops waiting in the northern desert, admiration for the airmen's deeds was tinged with sober assessment of Baghdad's will to resist.
I think that the Iraqi soldier, should he have the will to do that, would be much more capable of fighting that kind of war. And therefore, I still am concerned about the difficulty in which we're going to face ourselves. We're going to find ourselves here in the next few days.
But if Allied air superiority becomes entrenched, Saddam's army will be terribly exposed. Brian Barron, BBC News, Eastern Saudi Arabia.
And we just heard that those reports of fresh anti-aircraft fire in Baghdad have been denied. But air raids, of course, continued throughout the day over the Iraqi capital. Our Foreign Affairs editor, John Simpson, is there and reported his impressions of the raids until he was ordered to end live broadcasts.
The aircraft seem to be so high. The missiles make remarkably little noise. I mean, an extraordinary thing happened, I suppose, about an hour ago now. We were looking out of the window of our fifth floor room in the hotel, and a missile of some kind, a Tomahawk, I don't know, I'm not very good on these things, passed by on the line of the road on which the hotel stands at about the level of our windows, and it just went straight down the road. I mean, where it was aimed for, I don't know. So and yet there was no great noise about it. It was an extraordinary experience to see this thing going.
In Washington, President Bush has said things are going well. At a cabinet meeting, the president repeated that Iraq should withdraw from Kuwait with no concessions or conditions, and he said the action would continue until that happened. The American Defense Secretary, Dick Cheney, stressed the need for caution. He warned there will be casualties and said the operation could run for a considerable period of time. After 3 months of desert training, the British 7th Armoured Brigade is now moving closer to the Kuwaiti border. Our correspondent, Martyn is with them. He sent this report.
The tanks and reconnaissance vehicles rolling through the desert dust this evening marked the end of one phase of the British commitment, the beginning of another. By a strategic coincidence, the movement, long planned, took place on the day war broke out. After travelling overnight, these elements of the British 1st Division will be tomorrow in a completely different part of the desert, closer to the war, to be followed by others in the days ahead, thousands of men on the move.
We are not allowed to reveal in which direction these units will be going or what their final position will be when they reach their destination. But it's no secret that their training period here is over, and from their new position they will be able to join the battle whenever the signal is given.
The progress of the war has been followed intently by these ground troops who don't expect to be involved in it until Allied air power has weakened or demolished the Iraqi fortifications in their way. Air power will be decisive in stemming casualties, or even, in the best case, inducing an Iraqi surrender. British commanders are encouraged by events so far. It's going to be a question of timing and tactics, waiting for air power to do its work, and when it has, getting the tanks in place and the mechanized infantry to roll back the Iraqis from Kuwait. This is Martyn with a British battle group reporting for the British television pool.
In a special broadcast to the nation tonight, the Prime Minister, John Major, said the conflict was a just cause and it was right that we in Britain should play our part. Mr. Major had earlier told the Commons that military action would continue until Saddam Hussein comes to his senses and quits Kuwait.
After an hour at the palace briefing the Queen, John Major was back preparing for a ministerial broadcast, the first by a Prime Minister for more than a decade, and a technique not used by Mrs. Thatcher in the Falklands War. But Mr. Major believed that with strong cross-party support, he should explain why Britain was fighting in what he said was a just cause to get Iraq out of Kuwait.
I will not offer you rash promises about how quickly this can be done.
The operation on which we have embarked involves danger and sacrifice. But I am confident that it will succeed, and we know it is a battle which has to be fought.
Peace demonstrators were marching outside in Whitehall, and more protests are planned. The government's media advisers acknowledge the next few days could be a testing time for public opinion, as the Allied forces are determined there should be no let-up in the concentrated bombing of Iraqi targets, a prospect which Mr. Major said in his broadcast had to be faced.
The military operation must go on until the decisions of the United Nations are enforced. Then we can start searching again, and searching hard, for lasting solutions to the problems of the area.
The War Cabinet will assemble in Downing Street first thing in the morning. Ministers will get the latest intelligence assessment of the damage to Iraqi military targets. Talk of the conflict being over within days is said in Whitehall to be unrealistic, and the War Cabinet will go on meeting again throughout the weekend.
And we just had a report from the Saudi capital, Riyadh, that the RAF who are based there say they have lost a second aircraft. Well, I'll be back in 5 minutes with David Dimbleby for more comment and reaction to the first 24 hours of war and, of course, the latest details of that second missing RAF aircraft and the Allied operation. For now, good night.
Now on BBC One, as we approach the end of this momentous day, Cardinal Basil Hume, Archbishop of Westminster, speaks live with his thoughts and prayers.
After I'd heard that war in the Gulf had broken out, I went to my chapel in the middle of the night and I tried to pray. No words came to my lips, no thoughts to my mind. I just felt numb as the horror of what was happening in the Gulf slowly began to sink in. War is always a tragedy, however justified it may be. And I feel anguish for so many who tonight know only anxiety and sorrow. When I tried to pray last night, I felt helpless, that sense of helplessness, a kind of silent anguish, which was, I now realize, my prayer. God was reading in my troubled heart the words and thoughts I could not myself compose. I'm sure many of you also want to pray, but don't quite know how. I feel tonight, first of all, the need to say a word of sorrow to God. We are human, weak, and many times we fail. But I remember always that God loves a humble and a contrite heart. And at every moment, in spite of all our faults and weaknesses, God looks down on each of us with loving eyes, waiting for us to return to him. Prophet Isaiah spoke to men and women who were in despair. They had said, God has abandoned us, the Lord has forgotten us. Then the prophet gives them this wonderful word from God. Does a woman forget her baby at the breast, or fail to cherish the son of her womb? Yet, if even these forget, I will never forget you. We have the assurance then of the unshakable love of God for each of us, in his promise never to forget. As we reflect on a day when we've all heard much about Allied bombing raids and the grim reality of war has borne in on us, we must not forget those whose lives are directly touched
by the unfolding events in the Gulf. I know that for my part, I must try now to raise my mind and heart to God. And I know that 'tis my trying to pray that God sees and is pleased with, however much it may seem to me to be a failure. So let us pray for families and friends, anxious about their loved ones bravely playing their part in the conflict. We pray, Lord, that you will comfort and support them during the difficult times that lie ahead. We pray for all those in the armed forces, the medical workers, and those who care for the casualties on both sides. We pray that the horrors of war may inspire good deeds, unselfish love, and a longing for the ways of God rather than hatred and bitterness. We pray too for the victims of war on either side. We pray that you, Lord, will welcome those who die into your eternal and loving care, and that the injured may know your healing touch. Finally, we pray for our leaders who carry the heavy responsibility of taking decisions in this war. Grant them wise judgment and moral courage, and help them to act to bring lasting peace to the Gulf based on justice and truth. All these prayers, Lord, we commend to you this night. In your great love for each one of us, give us peace in our hearts, protect our loved ones, guide our leaders, help us to hope and to trust that out of this sad and difficult conflict, something better and more pleasing to you may emerge.
The speaker in Gulf Vigil was Cardinal Basil Hume, Archbishop of Westminster. Now on BBC One, we return to Martyn Lewis for an update on the news.
And the latest news from the continuing Gulf War is that the American television network CBS has just reported live from Tel Aviv that air sirens sounded in the Israeli city and were followed by a huge explosion. We have no more details on that at the moment. And we can also tell you more news about that second aircraft, which was reported lost by the RAF. It is a Tornado GR-1 fighter bomber, and it was lost in one of the latest sorties over Iraq. A senior Pentagon official has said this is still a very hostile environment for our aircraft. Iraqi anti-aircraft capability has not been destroyed. That is all for the moment. We will, of course, bring you more news the moment we get it, but for the moment, over to David Dimbleby and his guests.
And I'm joined now by Dr. Rosemary Hollis, who's a Middle East specialist from Royal United Services Institute, and by Dr. Philip Sabin of the War Studies Department of King's College London. Philip Sabin, first of all, perhaps you could just briefly react to that report of a huge explosion in Tel Aviv. What are the possibilities of the cause of that? What things could it be?
Had it not been for the sirens, I would have said a terrorist bomb. However, if there was some kind of warning, it seems most likely to be a missile, one of the missiles that escaped perhaps the bombing raid last night and that was fired against the Israeli capital. It doesn't sound as though it will do a great deal of damage, a single missile strike, unless, of course, it's been a lucky hit. The hope must be that Israel will not retaliate for that because of the political effects that would have on the alliance.
We have more news on that. We go back to Martyn Lewis in the newsroom. Martyn.
Yes, we hope we have more news on that explosion in Tel Aviv tonight, reported by CBS. Michael McMillan is on the phone from Jerusalem. Michael, what's been happening?
Well, Martyn, I can confirm that CBS have said that that explosion has taken place. We don't know the size of it. We don't know exactly when, but I think probably within the past half hour, should I say. I am in Jerusalem at the moment. Within the past 10 minutes, the air raid siren has gone off. The city is still lit, all the lights are still on, and there seems to be very little activity around. Of course, Israel has said that it would only sound these sirens if it believed it was being attacked with a missile, or if it believed that an enemy aircraft was entering its airspace. So we will really just have to wait and see, but obviously there's a degree of panic here because after nothing happened all day yesterday, I think that the Israelis thought that the risk was starting to disappear, but obviously it hasn't, and I think mindful in everybody's minds here would be those mobile Scud missile launchers, which we know that Saddam Hussein has, and which the Allies did not probably destroy in their air raids yesterday.
Has there been any news at all on Israeli radio?
There has been no news as yet. As I said, there's a degree of confusion here, Martyn, and as soon as we receive any news from Tel Aviv, of course, we'll come back to you immediately.
Michael, are you going to the air raid shelter now?
I am certainly going out to see what's happening. Whether I'm going to the air raid shelter immediately, I don't know. As I said, all the lights are still on in Jerusalem. I would imagine that those will go off when they regard an air raid as imminent. So let's find out some more details about what's been happening in Tel Aviv, and I will be back to you just as soon as I can.
Michael, we'll do exactly that, and we will wait for you to come back to us. And just to recap very briefly, that reported explosion, the report only comes from one source, CBS. We think perhaps a second American network, NBC, might have reported it as well. And they are saying that air raid sirens sounded in Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem, where Michael McMillan was reporting from, but Tel Aviv, and that was followed by a huge explosion. For the moment, back to David Dimbleby.
Philip Sabin, what is the kind of damage that these Scud missiles can in reality do if they travel from Iraq? What kind of warhead can they carry?
The good point for Israel is that the only type of Scud missiles that can hit Israel are the Al-Abbas or Al-Hussein missiles, which have been specially modified by Iraq to give them greater range at the expense of their payload, so they have a lower payload. Now, we know from experience in World War II and from the Iran-Iraq War that missiles are not as effective as propaganda, perhaps, or fear might make them. On average, they may only kill 1 or 2 people, but average isn't what we're looking at. We're looking at a single hit, and if it's been lucky, it could have killed up to 100 people. One hopes that that is not the case.
And might it be carrying some sort of chemical warhead, which was one of the things that was feared by Israel?
It could be, yes. This was one of the concerns. We do not know whether Saddam has been able to put chemical warheads on those missiles. It cannot be ruled out.
Well, we'll, needless to say, go back to the newsroom as soon as we have any more news about that. But let's now turn to the question we were talking about earlier on, which is what follows this war in terms of re-establishing a kind of peace and perhaps looking for some sort of balance in the Middle East. Rosemary Hollis, you're a specialist in the Arab world and at the Royal United Services Institute. Do you think there's a danger of the actual fact that the United States is able, by superior power, to impose a sort of Pax Americana on the Middle East to enforce the UN resolution, may create resentments in the Arab world that make it more difficult to achieve a long-term settlement?
Well, I think almost by definition, an imposed Pax Americana is going to fulfill some of the predictions of dissident Arab elements who are saying we are being used and abused by outsiders for their very own interests, and they're only here not to help us but to look after their needs. So I think it's only predictable that there is going to be backlash from the war in the Gulf as a result of the role of the United States and Britain.
Who would you identify as those most likely to jib at the Americans doing this? Would it include people who are part of the coalition against President Saddam?
Well,
or is it the people who are already against that and supporting him?
I suspect that the West is going to be blamed for not only whatever goes wrong in the ensuing few weeks, but also anything that anybody is feeling aggrieved about. It just, from their point of view, is going to compound it. So if they're poor and they're resentful of those who are rich, the United States is going to be perceived as protecting the rich. If they are Palestinian and without a homeland, then again, until the United States delivers something, they don't trust the motives of the West. And we haven't been able to demonstrate thus far that we can do anything for them. And they will need that proving to.
And is the heart of this the Arab-Israeli conflict?
It's at the hub of it in one sense, because it's a sort of litmus test for how good an Arab you are, how committed you are to the cause of the Palestinians, how ready you are to redress the balance that you feel has been some sort of outrage.
And your anti-Americanism will be fueled by the feeling that the United States is primarily a supporter of Israel.
Yes, that's part of how it works.
Sir David Steele, what do you think the first steps towards achieving some sort of long-term settlement, or at least taking the first moves towards that, would be if Saddam Hussein is defeated by this Allied force, if there is some sort of Middle Eastern peace conference or proposal for one?
Could I interpolate something, first of all, David, about the news from Tel Aviv? Last week it was very obvious to me that there's a great difference between the mood in Tel Aviv and the mood in Jerusalem, even though they're only an hour drive apart. And the reason is, of course, is that Jerusalem has the self-protection of being regarded as a holy city by the Muslims as well as by Jews and Christians. And that doesn't apply to Tel Aviv, and that's why the hit, if it is confirmed, has been on Tel Aviv and not on Jerusalem. So to come to your question, in my view, we have somehow, as I was saying earlier, got to recover the propaganda effort. And I think, if I can be optimistic about this, that what we've got to say to our Arab partners in the coalition is that what prevented us, it's an excuse really rather than a justification, but what prevented the international community from dealing with the Arab-Israel dispute was in fact the Cold War, that the Middle East was seen as yet another area of Soviet expansionism. And therefore you got the Americans lining up behind the Israelis and the Europeans lining up behind the Americans on that issue. Now that the Cold War is over, there is no excuse for that stalemate continuing. And here's where I believe the European community itself has got to have a distinctive role separate from the Americans. We have a long-standing historic interest in the area, which the Americans do not. The Americans are rightly or wrongly seen as the villains of the peace in so many Arab eyes, and in a sense this war will not have helped that. And therefore I think a great deal of initiative could pass to the European community.
But Sir David, we're fighting alongside the Americans as their closest ally, with the biggest Western force apart from theirs in the Gulf.
Yes, but what you're asking me is what happens after the war, and I'm now talking about the long-term scene and the change from dealing with the Middle East during the period of the Cold War to the new global situation, which ought to open up the way. I mean, let's remember that the European community 10 years ago produced the Declaration of Venice, but it's remained just a piece of paper. And I think that we can afford to take an initiative which perhaps isn't open to the Americans in order to get the International Peace Conference back on the agenda.
George Robertson, do you believe that, that we ought to, and Europe should, separate itself from the Americans, if that's how I understood it put by Sir David, and take an initiative?
Well, I think he's suggesting that there should be an initiative. It has to be part and parcel of the strengthened UN that we hope will come out of this war. And I think one of the heartening things about President Bush's broadcast last night was looking forward to the outcome, an outcome where the UN was strengthened and that the coalition put together against Saddam Hussein was something that would continue into the future. But if we're going to avoid the problem of the Arabs feeling that this was something put together simply to protect Western oil interests, then perhaps at an early stage, even during the fighting, we've got to make it clear that there is going to be a priority given to other UN resolutions, especially the UN resolutions regarding Arab Israel. And I think if we do that, we might avoid some of the bigger problems that could come from the fact that the military activity is taking place in the present form.
But despite the fact that there are 26, 28 countries involved in this, won't the perception be in the Arab world that this isn't really a United Nations operation, that the United Nations is a convenient cover for a Western, European and American operation? Because after all, it's the Americans who've taken the lead in all this. It's the Americans who one way or another have managed to persuade people to go along with their policy. It's not a... Is it right to see it as a sort of spontaneous United Nations reaction? And what Mr. Kinnock was saying about a hopeful sign for the UN, when the Americans are so much in the lead of both the military action and of the political side of things.
But that's why winning the argument is so important in the Middle East, that we've got now to make it clear that it is not precisely what you're saying it is. The perception may well be that, but there's got to be a political offensive that takes place at the same time that says that the Americans are as interested now in resolving the problems of Arab Israel and in delivering on the other UN Security Council resolutions. If they do that, then perhaps the coalition will be seen as being a wider coalition. And out of this tragedy, for it is a tragedy, there may well be the heartening prospect of some future settlement for the Middle East that goes well beyond the immediate conflict.
Winston Churchill, what would you see as the proper, very first steps after the defeat, if it happens, of President Saddam in this war?
Well, I think the very first step must be to rush medical aid to Baghdad for the civilian and indeed the military casualties once they've laid down their weapons. In terms of a settlement, I think there are really two elements that have to be addressed here. One is self-determination for the Palestinians, and there I think it's important that the United States should be involved with Europe and other countries in the search for a settlement there, because they have so much greater influence on Israel and a leverage over Israel than any other country. And the other element of it must be the creation of some form of defense pact among the Gulf and Middle East states, because they are not in a position individually to defend themselves. They must form their own form of defensive alliance, to which no doubt they would like to see European and American involvement. But it must be seen that the Arabs are in the lead.
David Steele?
Well, I agree with that, but I think Winston Churchill might perhaps go a little further, because what will be required, if there is to be any security agreement and permanent Middle East peace settlement, is a scale of United Nations military presence in the area at various strategic points, which we've not seen before. I'm not talking about the traditional UN peacekeeping forces, but forces to which we, the major powers, make major commitments under UN command for really a very long time to come. Otherwise, you will not get Israel to accept that her security is going to be looked after.
Rosemary, Hollis, you've heard these views about how the future ought to look and the first steps that ought to be taken. Do you think those are the right first steps? And do you think it is possible for the United States and for Europe to play the kind of role in this that is being suggested?
Yes, I think I would emphasize the point that Europe alone may well not be in a position to, as it were, deliver Israel. I'm not convinced that the United States is either, since it hasn't been up till now. And therefore, I'm assuming that in the fullness of time, some of the pieces of the picture will have changed, because if they haven't, there is no way through the maelstrom of the Arab-Israeli dispute. I think we would have found it already if it were that easy to solve. And given the position of the Palestinians and the position of Israel, unless there's some shift there, I don't know that the United Nations, without having to go through a lot of imposition all over again, is going to be able to solve the problem.
Philip Sabin, just come in on the military side of this. Excuse me. Do you think it's feasible to have a sort of Arab pact in the Middle East that secures the peace, that would secure Kuwait, for instance, in the future against this kind of activity against it by an aggressive neighbour?
I think it would be very, very difficult to have Kuwait simply defended by Saudi forces and Gulf Cooperation Council forces. There could be something done with the Egyptians, possibly, but I think we would also have to have some, perhaps only token, American and European forces there, just to show that the big stick was there in reserve if necessary.
We'll come back in a moment. We go to the newsroom now for a moment and join Martyn Lewis. Martyn?
We understand that 3 missiles have exploded in central Tel Aviv tonight. That is according to Israeli officials. The air raid sirens have been sounding, and the news was first reported by the American television network NBC. Tom Brokaw spoke to their man in Tel Aviv, Martin Fletcher. This is how the conversation went.
We're pretty sure 1 missile has landed in Tel Aviv, conventional warhead, possibly a second, Tom.
And what can we expect from the Israelis as a result of this attack if it is confined only to this?
If it's, well, we know pretty exactly, actually, because they've pretty much specified what they're going to do. If it's only conventional warheads, if it's only 1 or 2, if not too much damage is caused, they'll sit back and let the Americans handle it for them, as the Americans promised they would do. Israel did reserve the right, if a chemical warhead landed, to retaliate instantly, and as far as we know, it's not a chemical warhead, so we presume, I presume, that Israel would not take it into its own hands right now, but will certainly be telling the United States to make sure no more missiles are fired. Otherwise, Israel will say Israeli planes will take off and stop any more missiles being fired as far as they're able to.
And Israeli radio has instructed all citizens to put gas masks on and to go to a room that is sealed against gas. As we said, Israeli officials have confirmed that 3 missiles have hit central Tel Aviv. Michael McMillan is in Jerusalem, where there have also been air raid sirens. Michael, can you tell me what is happening?
I can tell you there's a certain amount of panic here, Martin. The air raid sirens went off here now about 15 minutes ago. I'm now in our office here where everyone has their gas mask on, obviously taking heed of the precautions which Israel radio have advised. We can indeed confirm that there have been 3 hits in Tel Aviv, 1 in the suburbs, I think 2 near the city centre. It's not really clear exactly what the damage has been. It's pretty well impossible to get through to Tel Aviv at the moment.
Michael, while you're talking, we can see pictures, I hope, from Cable News Network, one of their correspondents in Jerusalem. In fact, we've just seen his correspondent put his gas mask on, so I think perhaps it may be a prudent move for you to consider doing the same for your own safety,
Can you hear me?
if you judge that to be the right thing to do.
Yes, Martin, just one thing before we do that. I can tell you that I've heard Israeli jets in the sky above Jerusalem, so obviously the Air Force is on alert. We don't know whether this is a missile. We don't know whether any further threats will be from missiles or whether they'll be from Iraqi bombers. Remember those Su-24 Sukhoi bombers which can fly under radar, and the Israelis have been extremely worried about them. And also, of course, remember yesterday that the Allies probably didn't manage to take out those mobile Scud missile launchers. They thought that they had destroyed the permanent missile sites in H2 and H3 in western Iraq, but they didn't know that they had managed to hit any of those mobile launchers. So it could well be that the missiles that have landed on Tel Aviv were from mobile launchers, and launchers which are hidden underground. So they're not. The Americans couldn't detect them by satellite photography, and they couldn't detect them from aerial reconnaissance.
Michael, for your information, NBC Network also quoted a senior Israeli official as saying the missile launch, and we're talking now about the missiles that hit the center of Tel Aviv, the missile launch was not detected by radar defenses. Does that surprise you?
Well, it doesn't surprise me. We were down on the West Bank, yesterday, and there seemed to be, and that's, should I say, on the hilltops in the Jordan Valley overlooking the West Bank. Now, there seemed to be a degree of confusion as far as the Israeli commanders were concerned there. They didn't know exactly how many minutes they would have to warn against an incoming missile. Also, those were Hawk anti-aircraft missile batteries that we saw down there, and they're not capable of intercepting an incoming missile, although we did know that the Israelis had obtained from the Americans advanced Patriot missiles, which are capable of doing just that. But I don't think that those Patriot missiles were in action soon enough to intercept these missiles.
Michael McMillan, thank you very much indeed. Reach for the gas mask, Michael, and come back to us when you can. And we have just heard that a CBS correspondent reporting live from Tel Aviv says that he heard 5 explosions altogether. But CBS is quoting United States defense officials as saying that 2 missiles had hit Tel Aviv. And the Pentagon has just this moment confirmed that Scud missiles have landed in Israel. Well, with me now is Admiral Sir James Eberle, who is a noted tactician. He was Commander-in-Chief of Naval Home Command in the early 80s. Sir James, is it automatic now, do you think, that Israel will enter the war?
It does depend on whether this has been a chemical attack and what further attack is underway. Clearly, it is in the Israeli interest to exercise restraint. But if there is a chemical attack, it has been made clear that they will respond, and that could be the start of a larger Israeli involvement in the war.
And yet it is very important to the Americans that Israel does not enter the war. So do you imagine that even now President Bush would be talking to Yitzhak Shamir to try and assess the extent of the attack and to see whether it can be contained?
One would hope so, but clearly the visit by Lawrence Eagleburger the other day went over all these issues. Certainly if Israel can be kept out of the war, if we can prevent Saddam Hussein changing the political character of the war, which is what he's trying to do, then that is very much to our advantage.
Well, we just heard that the Pentagon are saying between 3 and 5 missiles have hit Tel Aviv. You think it may conceivably, there may conceivably be a scenario in which America would persuade Israel not to launch an attack, even though missiles have hit the center of Tel Aviv with one assumes, some casualties?
It just depends on the extent of the damage, but we're just on the brink here. The Israelis have said if the missile attack is light, 1, 2 or 3 missiles, then they would leave the Americans to respond. Clearly, it is Saddam Hussein's wish that he would get the Israelis involved, and therefore he will try to launch an attack of a sufficient strength to ensure that the Israelis must respond.
It is now clear that there has been a major attack on Tel Aviv. Just to recap, we know that there have been at least 5 missiles, Scud missiles, which have landed in the center of Tel Aviv. The air raid sirens have gone off. Israeli radio has broadcast warnings. In fact, many people, the whole of Israel, was told to keep listening to Israeli radio during this time. We are now going over live to CNN. Yes, I'm sorry. We were going over to CNN. We won't for the moment. We can't for the moment. But we do know that the Israeli radio has urged all its citizens to put on gas masks and to head for what they call a room that is sealed against gas. There is no word yet as to whether those Scud missiles actually were chemical weapons or whether they contained conventional warheads. Given the extent, Sir James, of the attack by the Americans on the Iraqi positions, and the fact that the Americans said earlier that they believed that they had destroyed Iraq's chemical capability, do you think it is possible that they could still have Scud missiles with chemical warheads?
This is a technical question rather than an operational one, because the mobile missiles were very difficult to detect. And I think what has happened tonight bears out the wisdom of both Secretary Tom King and Dick Cheney, who have said that we should not exaggerate our hopes and expectations because of the very successful day that we've had. There are always great surprises in war. Here is the next turn of this unfortunate conflict.
While we are waiting for more information from Israel, which we will of course bring you the very moment it comes in, could I just look with you at what has happened as far as the Allied attack, continuing attacks on Iraq are concerned? Looking ahead, is it possible that after a week or so of the bombing, Iraqi defences in Kuwait would be so decimated that the British ground troops there would simply be able to, once they had cleared the minefields, walk into Kuwait?
I think just to walk in perhaps is a little over-optimistic, but certainly as soon as command of the air has been fully achieved, then the weight of the Allied air attack will move onto the Iraqi ground forces and their lines of supply.
Do you think there is some indication that that might be happening already tonight, with the reports that the B-52 bombers out of Turkey and Diego Garcia are carpet bombing the heavily fortified Iraqi defences in Kuwait?
Indeed, and there have been reports that some of our Jaguar aircraft have been occupied in attacking targets in Kuwait. It's important that pressure on the ground troops is built up and maintained from the start.
Going back to the Israeli factor, which is clearly now becoming increasingly important, how quickly would you expect the Israeli authorities to react now in terms of saying what they are doing? Do you think there will be some kind of a statement from Yitzhak Shamir, or do you think the Israelis, if they're going to take any military action, will simply just do it?
This is some speculation. I think they will just do it. They have quite clearly made plans in advance of what it is they're going to do, how they will announce it.
Let me stop you now. We're going over to the NBC network, who are talking to Martyn Fletcher in Tel Aviv at this moment.
To achieve what he wants to now, a chemical warfare attack, it appears tonight in Tel Aviv on Israel. Martyn, we'll give you a few moments to collect yourself and to get some additional information for us, if you can there. NBC's John Cochran at the White House. John, it had been going by all accounts well, but there was great caution at the White House all day long. This was the great political fear of the administration, wasn't it?
That's right. Just about a half an hour ago, I was talking to an official here who's been monitoring this very carefully. He said, if we can just get through the night, if the Israelis stay out of the war, we may be home free. We were talking at that time about would the Syrians go into a join in a ground attack into Kuwait, and he thought that as long as the Israelis were out of the war, the Syrians would keep their private word to the coalition to join in an attack into Kuwait, although the Syrians said they would not go into Iraq. Of course, that's the kind of thing, all bets would be off if the Israelis got into the war. And I can kind of confirm what Fred Francis and others have been saying the last few minutes, which is, if indeed the attacks on Israel were not great, the United States did not expect the Israelis to join in, that in fact the Israelis would let us do it, Tom.
We are so secure in this country. We are so buffeted from the violence that occurs in so many other parts of the world. It's hard, I suppose, for many Americans to imagine taking 5 missile hits on your principal city in a country and trying to decide yet whether that was a major hit or not. Do you have any idea what the threshold may be before the Israelis would feel compelled to strike back, John? Has that been worked out in any way, or will there just be consultation?
Well, the person I talked to didn't know what the threshold would be. He talked about minor. I don't know what minor is. And of course, Martyn Fletcher seemed to be talking about if there were only 3 or 4 hits, and of course if they were not chemical. And but now it seems to be major enough now that the Israelis must be giving a very serious consideration to joining this, and I would imagine that there's consultation going on right now. Incidentally, even though we're hearing from the Pentagon and the State Department, the White House does not want to talk about this. It's too sensitive. We're not hearing anything from Marlon Fitzwater yet.
Fred Francis, please, at the Pentagon. What do you have for us, Fred?
Tom, an official told me this is not minor. This is a major attack on Israel. And we must remind the viewer that Israel has a like response. Israel has Jericho missiles. It does not have to send its air machine over Arab countries to attack Baghdad. It can attack Baghdad in kind with Jericho missiles, 2 different missiles, one with a 700, one with an 1,100-mile range. And but I caution you that this is a serious attack on Israel.
All right, Fred, let's go to Martyn Fletcher. We have only a few moments left on the satellite time, Martyn. You heard that, a major attack, in the words of the American Defense Department. What can we expect next in Israel?
Well, before I speculate on that, Tom, let me just update you on the details. We have one large building in Tel Aviv that has collapsed from a missile, and we have confirmation that the victims of chemical war have been taken to that very hospital that I mentioned earlier. So it looks pretty serious, and it's the kind of attack that Israel said, if it happened, they'd take retaliation into their own hands. I can't say now what they're going to do, but they said chemical war means Israeli retaliation.
Yeah, it is a very bad situation, getting much worse moment by moment. It seems to me, absolutely unavoidable for the Israelis to stay out of this, if that, in fact, is the case. What kind of a building was it that was collapsed, Martyn? Do we know? Was it residential or commercial?
Don't know if it was residential or commercial, Tom. We're trying to find that out, but there are victims which suggest that it was commercial. That it suggests it was residential. It's in a combined residential commercial area in the poorer part of Tel Aviv.
All right, we are now getting word from NBC News in Jerusalem that that city, which is holy to all of the religions in that region, was not in fact struck. But Tel Aviv, which is the commercial center, the biggest, most important city in, that's Jerusalem, it was not hit, we are told, by missiles. But Tel Aviv was hit. But everyone there has been told to go on alert because Israel is a tiny country. It's about the size of a good Texas county, and any attack anywhere in that country could have ramifications for the entire nation. NBC's Martyn Fletcher reporting that a major building has been hit in Tel Aviv, that victims of a chemical warfare attack have been taken to a hospital. How serious and how widespread it is, we cannot say at this time, but the fact that one has been launched at all makes it serious almost beyond my ability to describe it. And we do not know where Operation Desert Storm will go from here. It means
NBC reporting graphically and vividly that there has been a chemical attack on Tel Aviv. Up to 5 Scud missiles with chemical warheads have hit the city. It is also clear that Jerusalem, which, as Tom Brokaw said, is a holy city, not just for the Israelis, has not been attacked. Can you tell me, Sir James, what you think, if this is a major attack, and we heard NBC's man at the Pentagon saying that the Pentagon were saying that this is a major attack, is it now inevitable that Israel will enter the war?
I think it is inevitable that the Israelis will strike back. What will be important then is whether they come into the war in a more extended way. If they merely make a retaliatory strike, let us say on Baghdad, then that could be the end of it. But if they would then start to join in by maintaining an air bombardment into Iraq, then that's an even more serious escalation of the war.
But one could ask why, apart from pure motives of revenge, the Israelis should strike back at this stage when you have got what appears to be a very comprehensive, carefully targeted plan by the Allied air forces to hit selected important targets in Baghdad, indeed in Iraq and Kuwait. Is there any need? Is there any need for the Israelis to strike back, given the size of the Allied blitzkrieg on the Iraqi forces?
I think there will be an emotional need. Whether there will be a military need to follow up that first response, I think, is an entirely different question. And one has then to ask, too, if there has been some sort of an agreement with the Americans, what is the price, in political terms, in some future settlement that the Israelis will have extracted for their agreement to restraint?
Just to give us some idea of the extent to which the Americans have been able to precisely target targets in Iraq, I gather that the Soviet foreign minister has said tonight that Allied air attacks on Baghdad have completely destroyed Saddam Hussein's palace. Saddam Hussein, we assume, was not there because he would be unlikely to stay in his palace during the course of the war once it had started. But what would you think, from what you know about Saddam Hussein's state of mind, how do you think he would react to the knowledge that this very expensive palace, which he had built with great care and affection, had been destroyed?
I think the important impact will be on the Iraqi military machine as a whole. They will see demonstrated once again the extraordinary accuracy that the West can maintain in its attack and avoid civilian casualties in other areas.
Sir James, thank you very much. Just to recap, Israeli radio has reported a missile attack on Tel Aviv. Israeli officials in Washington have confirmed the attack on that city. The American television company NBC reports as many as 5 missiles. Earlier, other news agencies had reported that sirens sounded in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Saddam Hussein had warned before the Allied onslaught that Israel would be attacked by Iraqi forces if there was a war in the Gulf. We will, of course, give you more information on that attack on Tel Aviv as it comes in. For the moment, back to David Dimbleby.
We heard Tom Brokaw of NBC saying that he couldn't overstate the gravity of this attack and these 5 missiles on Tel Aviv containing, we're told, chemical warheads. So let's try and assess what the gravity is, what the significance is, and why it was important for Iraq to try and bring Israel into the war at this stage. Let's just deal first of all with the weaponry. These missiles, Scud missiles carrying chemical warheads, do they have the same constraints on them that you were previously describing conventional warheads as having, as not being able to do very much damage, or are they far more serious, not just psychologically, but in practice?
I think the main impact is going to be psychological on the Israeli public and on the Israeli decision makers. The same constraints of payload apply. You still need about as much chemical weapon pound for pound to kill particularly protected populations as you do high explosive. What I'm more worried about is this report that there has been this lucky hit and that a building seems to have been destroyed, because that can kill, as we know, lots and lots of people. But psychologically, the fact that this is chemical weapons, the emotive response that that will cause from the Jewish people in particular, that may be politically more of concern.
Winston Churchill, you were in Israel recently. What do you know about the reaction? Because we've heard, of course, about the agreement made with the United States that they would try and allow the United States to respond, except under certain circumstances. What did they tell you about those circumstances?
Of course, a multiple missile attack against Israel was always Saddam Hussein's ace card in his effort to drag Israel into the war. And when I was in Israel 6 months ago, I had a briefing at a very high level in which extreme concern was expressed to me about these Scud missiles, the modified Scuds, which have the range of reaching Israel, based on H-3, the westernmost Iraqi airfield. And the Israeli information at that time was that not only did they have chemical warheads for these weapons, but they also had biological. Now, that would be even more serious, far more serious, if, in fact, it were to transpire that one or more of these missiles contained biological warheads, and it would be very difficult under those circumstances for the Israelis not to strike back massively.
Rosemary, Hollis, how does it benefit Iraq, being bombarded by the United States and by our own forces yesterday and overnight today, to draw in Israel with all the extra firepower that Israel has and the ability to attack Baghdad with weapons? What is the strategy from Saddam Hussein's point of view?
It turns a war over Kuwait into a regional war where the Arab independents, if you like, are confronting those that they see as having imposed empires on them in the past, and along with that, Israel, which is considered by that element in the Arab world to be a sort of agent of the West.
And is it irrelevant to this that Saddam Hussein, if there is an Israeli attack, will have brought it on himself?
Yes, but I don't think there's been enough understanding of the way he's working. In purely military terms, he would have tried to avert the war, excuse me, because he knew it was going to be pretty devastating whether Israel was involved or not. But he's not operating on that basis.
On what basis is he operating on?
Well,
I mean, would he describe this as an attempt by a big Arab nation to destroy Israel? Is that how he'll present this attack on Israel?
Well, he will have been able to demonstrate that he can do some of the things that he said he could do, which I imagine is important for his prestige and credibility with his potential community. Dr.
Sabin, how would you think this would develop now? I mean, for a start, is it surprising to you that these missiles got through? We knew that the fixed missiles were not the only ones, and there were mobile Scuds that it was not easy to take out. But are Israeli air defences not sufficient to protect them?
No, they are not, unfortunately. There has been a lot of hope placed in the Patriot missile, which is in Saudi Arabia, and some were given to Israel. But the Patriot was not designed to shoot down enemy missiles. It's a missile to shoot down enemy planes. So it's not surprising it didn't succeed. The Israelis are developing an Arrow anti-ballistic missile, but that won't be ready for 5 years.
Sir David, in Edinburgh, what is your reaction to this turn of events that we've been hearing about in the last half hour?
Well, it is, as everybody agrees, very, very serious indeed. Again, last week, the Israelis were facing up to the prospect. They were really prepared for this. They were expecting it. There were endless television commercials of showing people how to put tape round the doors of the rooms and use their gas masks and so on. And with typical Jewish good humor, I mean, they were saying this was going to happen, and indeed, sadly, it has happened. The danger really is now that you get a sort of, as John Eberle was saying, a revenge attack which destroys the particular style of operation that has been so successful so far, the pinpointing of military targets, and you get instead some kind of assault on Baghdad, a revenge assault on Baghdad on the civilian population, and then you've got exactly what Saddam Hussein has been trying to angle for, which is a portrayal of the slaughter of the Arabs by the infidels, Americans, Israelis, everybody else.
Are you suggesting that the Israeli Air Force would attack civilian targets, or would not be so fussy about its choice of targets in these circumstances if it's taken civilian casualties?
Well, I'd be interested in what your military expert has to say. I don't know the answer to the question about what the nature of the missiles are that Israel has, but if it's a revenge attack, presumably it will be not as discriminate as the technology that we have. I don't know the answer to that question.
Philip Sabin,
but all I'm saying is I'm pointing out the danger of the cycle that we may be getting into overnight.
Philip Sabin, can you answer that point?
Yes, I can. Israel has a Jericho missile which could be fired back against Iraqi cities. It is somewhat more accurate than the Scuds, but not enough to hit precise targets. It would hit residential areas. Yeah. However, what Israel might do, and what it's done in response to this kind of attack in the past, when Scuds have been fired against it in the Middle East wars, has been to launch a massive attack against strategic targets, as it calls them, economic targets, rather than killing civilians for its own sake. But that would depend on using Israeli aircraft, which are much more accurate than Israeli missiles.
And what kind of targets would those be, economic targets?
They would go against desalination plants, dams, anything which would hurt the Iraqi infrastructure, that would hurt the Iraqi people indirectly, if you like, but that wouldn't be seen as a pure terror bombing of the kind which this seems to have been.
The trouble with that, of course, is that it is, as you say, directed against the people. And the very point that John Major has made throughout today very effectively is that we have no quarrel with the Iraqi people. And that's how the whole thing may escalate, I'm afraid.
Is the pressure on the Israeli government, George Robertson, not going to be very powerful indeed to take some sort of action, regardless of any agreement they may have made with the United States, regardless of any promises the Pentagon may even now be making to the Israeli government in the way of defending them and protecting them from further attack?
Well,
you have to answer that question in a moment, because you must just go to the newsroom first and rejoin Martyn Lewis. Martyn, I'll come back.
And we have confirmation that 2 missiles have landed in the Tel Aviv area and 1 missile has landed on Haifa. In addition to that, we have from the cable news network a report that a total of 10 missiles have landed in Israel and that there are more incoming missiles. Michael McMillan is in Jerusalem. Michael, what do you know from there?
Martyn, I hope you can still hear me, because we've all got our gas masks on here.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can very well.
What I can tell you is that the latest reports are that 8 missiles have landed in and around the Tel Aviv area. We can't tell you at this stage whether they're chemical warheads. We simply don't know. Israel radio in the past minute has said that a state of war emergency now exists in Israel. They have told everybody to put their gas masks on and to be at full alert. What I can tell you is that the streets of Jerusalem are now deserted, although no missile has landed in the Jerusalem area. We have heard within the past 5 minutes, however, that Israel's security forces have sealed off an area at Ramallah on the West Bank. Now, that's about 15 miles from here. We don't know if that's the result of an attack there. That, of course, is a Palestinian homeland. And we're awaiting more details at this stage. But just to recap, the latest information that we're receiving here, 8 missile attacks, Scud missiles in Tel Aviv. And we do not know whether those were chemical warheads or not, Martyn.
Michael, I hear what you're saying. Is there any indication at all that the Israeli military machine is preparing to retaliate, given that a state of war has been declared?
I would suspect that the Israeli military machine is preparing to retaliate at this moment. Don't forget what the Israelis said before. If Iraq attacks Israel, Israel will respond. It will know exactly how to respond. Now, there was some debate here over the past 2 weeks about a measured response or perhaps no response at all. Perhaps if 1 or 2 missiles landed in Israel. It would look as though the attack on Israel has been much more significant than that. And I think we've got to presume that the Israeli military, the Israeli Air Force, will respond in kind.
You don't think that the Israeli Air Force would be persuaded by the size of the Allied attack on the Iraqi forces in Iraq and Kuwait, it would be persuaded by the size of that attack that Israel could still stay out of the war despite this attack on Tel Aviv.
That, of course, is for the Israeli authorities to decide. But that's not really in the Israeli psyche, Martyn. When Israel has been attacked in the past, it has responded in kind, and I would expect it to do the same this time. It would be very difficult for the Israeli government, if it has taken 8 missile hits from Iraq, to stand back and say, no, we're not going to respond, we're going to rely on our friends, the Americans and the Western allies, to defend us. Israel just doesn't operate that way. And I think that given the size of this attack in Tel Aviv, that they will respond. I can't really see any other action that they can take at this stage. But we'll have to wait and see.
Michael McMillan, in Jerusalem, where we should stress there has not, to our knowledge, been an attack. The attacks, the Scud missiles, have so far been concentrated on Tel Aviv and on Haifa, it would seem. And Michael says he does not know whether they have chemical warheads, although there is one report from Israeli sources saying that victims of chemical attacks have been taken to hospital. Michael, thank you very much. We will come back to you as and when you have more information. Charles Wheeler is in our Washington studio now. Charles, what is the latest from Washington?
The Pentagon has confirmed that there have been multiple launches of missiles, probably mobile Scuds. There have been some 9 to 12 explosions, but some of these are described as secondary. In other words, we don't know quite how many missiles have dropped. Somewhere about 6. Satellite photography has apparently picked up less than 12, somewhere between 6 and 12 launches, and the American networks, who've been broadcasting extraordinary scenes of correspondents wearing gas masks, have told their correspondents they must on no account take their gas masks off, they must keep the windows shut, and all American networks are talking about inevitable Israeli retaliation.
Charles, we have seen some of those scenes here in this program. Can you tell me what the United States will be advising Yitzhak Shamir and his army officers to do?
I have absolutely no idea. I assume there must be a contingency plan to cover this, since it was threatened by Saddam Hussein that he would attack Israel. Presumably there is some degree of coordination, but this is really up to the Israelis. If the Israelis are attacked by missiles, the Israelis are going to respond, whatever the Americans advise. I think everybody here accepts that. It is regarded as an enormously serious development, quite obviously for political reasons. Nobody knows, with Israel in the war, how the Arab allies, Syria, possibly Egypt, Jordan, will react.
And you don't think that Israel might take account, even at this late hour, of the global importance of Israel going into the war? You don't think that the Israelis will sit back for a moment and say, look, there is pinpoint, precision, almost blanket bombing going on in
Martyn, I'm getting a lot of interruption from engineers on the line calling Washington, but if you're still with me, I think Washington is going to have to accept whatever Israel now decides. And although you can imagine that if there are planes in the air coming from all directions, American planes carrying out a prearranged bombing missions, and Israeli planes retaliating to a totally unexpected development, there might be aerial chaos. But this is something that nobody here can tell you now, and the Pentagon is saying very little, presumably because it's not in a position to answer that kind of question yet.
But Charles, and I'm hoping the engineers have gone from your line, how would you assess the chances of the Israelis, even at this late hour, reining back because of the extent of the pinpoint precision blanket bombing of the Iraqi positions in Iraq and Kuwait? I think the line has actually become so bad that you can no longer hear me at this moment. Charles, can you hear me now?
They did lose the line, did they?
Charles, can you hear me? No, I'm afraid that we have lost Charles Wheeler in Washington. So allow me to recap very briefly that Israeli radio has reported a missile attack on Israel. The rockets, we are told, and it is somewhere between 6 and 12, according to Charles Wheeler in Washington. The launches were spotted by American intelligence satellites, but clearly not in time to give Israel perhaps as full a warning as Israel might have liked, because we hear that there are some casualties in Tel Aviv where those rockets, some of those rockets struck. One rocket, we are told, has struck Haifa, and the number that actually hit Israel, as I say, between 6 and 10. One report we had from Michael McMillan was that 8 missiles have struck. We also know that no missiles have fallen on Jerusalem, which is, of course, a holy place to the Arabs as well as to the Israelis. So we have, in fact, an eyewitness account from AP's bureau chief in Israel, Marcus Eliasson, who was in Tel Aviv. He said, "I felt a shockwave before I took my family into a room that was sealed with plastic sheeting and tape to prevent the infiltration of gas." We have a videotape report coming up of Martyn Fletcher of NBC in Tel Aviv.
I'm keeping a tally here of the explosions as I'm hearing them and being told about them. My tally says 12 or 13 missiles in Israel altogether. That's 3, including 3 in the north of Israel, near Haifa and the city of Safat, which are sources out in the north have been calling us about. He doesn't know if it's chemical or conventional warheads up there, but we're in double figures with missiles now, Tom.
All right, and so far as we know, just one warhead with chemical capacity, or is that impossible to say at this hour?
Well, at least one, Tom. I can't add to that, I don't know. But it seems to me pretty sure that there'd be a mixture, because this is a typical tactic of confusion.
And here in London, Triona Holden has been pulling together the disparate reports that have been coming in of this missile attack on Tel Aviv. This is her report.
First reports of an attack against Israel started coming in just after midnight our time. Journalists from the American news organization CNN broadcast live from Jerusalem as they prepared for chemical weapons to hit the city.
Our senior executive producer, do not, don't open the window if you would, please.
Go ahead. They'd been warned to put on their gas masks as quickly as possible, as reports indicated that a number of Scud missiles had been fired at Israel by Iraq. It's not clear yet how many, but eyewitnesses report at least 3 explosions. And in Tel Aviv, journalists said that city was also under attack.
But we have just got a report that 3 more missiles have fallen in the north of Israel. We don't know if there's a chemical warhead there or not. There's been an announcement on the radio that all citizens should put their gas masks on. They should stay in their sealed rooms, which would normally be in a high place in their building. They should not go down to the basement, to the bomb shelters, which is where you go for conventional war. So it's clear that the Israeli government is fearing, well, it's happening, as we know, gas wars. We don't know how many.
And a short time ago, Martyn Fletcher, who's been monitoring police radio reports, said that missiles are in double figures. At least one of them is a chemical weapon. The Israelis have been preparing for some time for a chemical weapons attack, and they have made it clear to the Pentagon that if Iraq launched a non-conventional weapons attack against them, they would reserve their right to retaliate.
News of a multiple missile attack on Israel has raised fears of chemical weapons being used. In fact, we know that some chemical weapons have been used and that Israel has declared a state of war. Fergus Walsh has been assessing the threat that these chemical weapons pose to the Allies.
The spectre of chemical warfare haunts every Allied soldier in the Gulf. In this exercise, the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards have been caught in a chemical attack and 2 soldiers injured. British troops in the Gulf are equipped with nuclear, biological and chemical suits which provide good protection. But NBC suits are clumsy to wear and extremely uncomfortable, especially in hot desert conditions, something Saddam Hussein is well aware of.
He is more likely to use chemical weapons to force the Americans and British and other servicemen into their protective clothing. In so doing, he will reduce their efficiency. It depends on the tasks that the servicemen have to carry out, but the protective clothing could reduce their ability to carry out tasks by anything between 30 to 80%.
Saddam Hussein has already shown the will to use chemical weapons, even against his own people. Mustard gas was used in 1988 to wipe out 5,000 Kurdish men, women and children in the Iraqi town of Halabja. These satellite pictures show Iraq's Chemical Weapons Research Centre at Salman Pak, south of Baghdad. The main production centre is at Samarra, 60 miles northwest of the capital, built with Western technology and thought to be producing 60 tons of mustard gas a month and up to 8 tons of nerve gas. It's thought Iraq has fitted chemical warheads to ballistic missiles, some with a range of up to 400 miles, capable of reaching targets in Israel and northern Saudi Arabia. Longer-range missiles are also being developed, which could strike further into Allied territory. Before going out to the Gulf, many American troops received chemical protection training at this military base in Alabama, said to be the only one in the world where lethal doses of gas are used in exercises. Nerve gas kills by blocking messages from the brain to the muscles, leading to paralysis and causing death through asphyxiation. British troops have been issued with spring-operated syringes containing an antidote to nerve agents. Any chemical weapons casualties will be flown back to Britain as soon as possible. Doctors here haven't treated British troops for the effects of mustard gas poisoning since the First World War.
Mustard-type agents that are thought that it is possible might be used actually cause an injury very similar to a burn, forming large blisters wherever the agent contacts the skin and also causing burns within the eyes. And the blisters are treated very much as ordinary burns are, with the same sort of dressings and creams that we use, but they take a lot longer to heal.
But it's the long-term effects of mustard gas which can kill.
It can ulcerate the eyes and cause blindness, and it can affect bone marrow and many internal organs. It can have quite a prolonged effect on the patient.
Gas! 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 But it's not just mustard and nerve gas which the Allied troops may face. The head of the CIA, William Webster, says Iraq is able to wage germ warfare and is developing weapons which can spread cholera, typhoid and anthrax. But opinions are divided on Saddam's biological weapon capability.
I don't think the Iraqis are very advanced at all in their development of biological weapons. There has been talk about the use of anthrax, cholera and typhoid. Now, cholera and typhoid are not particularly useful biological weapons. They are diseases, really, that occur as a result of concentration of people, particularly refugees. You would have to infect watercourses with those two agents for them to be viable. Anthrax is more of a problem, but it's difficult to work out that it would be really effective in the sort of desert environment.
Saddam Hussein has made it perfectly clear in the past that in a Gulf War he will use chemical weapons, outlawed under international law for more than 6 decades. How the United States would respond is unclear. It has massive stockpiles of poison gas, but is unlikely to use them, and may rely instead on massive conventional strikes against military targets and chemical weapons plants.
And up to 8 Scud missiles have apparently hit Israel, 3 of them in Tel Aviv tonight. It is thought that at least one of them contained a chemical warhead, because there are reports from official Israeli sources are saying that people have been taken to hospital in Tel Aviv to be treated for chemical injuries. We understand that the rockets, where the Scud missiles were launched from mobile launchers in western Iraq. That is according to Pentagon sources who, as we heard from Charles Wheeler earlier, were monitoring the launch with their intelligence satellites. And for the moment, we will, of course, CBS, the American network, are at this moment reporting incoming missiles to Dhahran Air Base in Saudi Arabia. We have no independent or second confirmation of that. We will, of course, bring you news as it comes in, but it is quite clear tonight that Iraq, the retaliation that everyone wondered why it wasn't happening, when it would happen, the answer is that the retaliation is tonight on Israel and, according to one report, on Dhahran Air Base. We will, of course, stay on the air and bring you news the very minute it comes in, but for now, Back to David Dimbleby.
These loathsome chemical and biological weapons, which we heard so vividly described in that film, if it is true that they've been used by Iraq on any scale tonight against Israel, what is the effect on the course of this war? What's your view of it, Dr. Sabin?
I think the effect will be more political than military. If, for example, the reports are true that there are incoming missiles to Dhahran Air Base, the inaccuracy of those weapons and the fact that we now have the warning from the Israeli attack so that people can have their gas masks on should mean, hopefully, that there is not a great deal of military effect. The problem is, it's been suggested that the West would strike back with much greater force against Iraqi military targets. That's rather hard to do, since we're already at an all-out attack on Iraqi military targets, and our options for escalation are limited.
If he has these capacities with his missiles to attack, why did he wait 24 hours and take the damage and the punishment that he took yesterday before deciding to retaliate?
I think his decision-making must have been that he was caught by surprise in the initial attack. Baghdad was well lit. The attack was very easy because of that. Any attack at that time by Iraq with these missiles would have been ragged. He decided to wait to mass these weapons in secret and to launch them as he had to do in a coordinated wave, thus getting through any defenses that the West might have been able to have or Israel might have been able to have, and having the maximum shock effect, as indeed it has done.
What do you think, Winston Churchill, you've been talking, or you have talked in the past with Israeli intelligence. What do you think the Israeli reaction would be? Because presumably politically, it's almost impossible now for the Israeli government and the cabinet not to react.
Well, I think that there's no question that if there are widespread casualties caused by chemical or biological agents, the Israelis will have no choice vis-à-vis their own public opinion, but to strike back, and they will strike back very hard indeed. I've known the Israeli Air Force over more than 20 years, and they would have a pre-programmed series of targets, and it would not be many minutes before the Israeli Air Force would be on its way to those targets, and of course that would have enormous consequences for the whole of Desert Storm operation.
Would the Pentagon be trying to restrain them, or George Bush be trying to restrain them from reacting in that way?
They would certainly be trying as hard as they can to restrain them, but they would recognize that if there are widespread casualties caused by such weapons of mass destruction, that there would be no holding the Israelis.
And when you talk about the consequences for Desert Storm, what are the consequences in your view?
Well, I think it would put enormous pressure on the alliance, on the 28-nation alliance, above all on the Arab members, on the Syrians, on the Egyptians, and to quite a degree on the Saudis as well.
So the thing may fall apart. George Robertson, do you agree with that? That the coalition may be in danger tonight as a result of this reported attack of between 6 and 10 missiles, or perhaps more, Scud missiles from Iraq on Israel?
Well, that's of course the danger, and it's a terrible danger as well. But remember that the Israelis know that danger as well. You know, I don't think that we can, you know, instantly in a studio here, sort of coming to a conclusion, sort of say what the Israelis will do. There's been 5 months essentially to prepare, and as David Steele rightly said, the Israelis have expected that there was going to be this kind of attack. They know the implications of taking the action that is now being talked about. They know that that takes the war into a whole new dimension that will not be to the advantage of Israel. So perhaps it's not just the pressure from the Americans, but its own internal logic that might actually argue against some action. And we've got to hope, very sincerely indeed, that that's the case.
So David Steele, do you think there's a chance of that happening, of Israel holding back despite this news tonight?
I certainly share George Robertson's hope, but I think it must be hope at this stage rather than expectation. It's asking an awful lot of any country to forgo the right of self-defense, and that's really what we're asking Israel to do. What I do hope is that if there is any retaliation, that they try to stick with the strategy of the rest of the coalition, which is to go for military targets. Because I don't necessarily think the coalition would fall apart if Israel got involved at this stage, because if chemical weapons have been used, I think there will be a sufficient shock around the rest of the countries involved in the Allied force to say, well, this really is beyond anything that we can tolerate, and therefore there would be, I think, some measure of understanding at Israel's wish to strike back. But I share George Robertson's hope that they would not do so, but it is asking a lot.
Well, it would be no surprise if he did use chemical weapons, because after all, he used them against his own people.
Well,
in the war with
exactly.
Iran,
I
against
mean,
the Turks.
everyone's been expecting this all along, but the fact that it has actually happened must mean that the provocation is generally seen to be so much greater against Israel than in the conventional warfare that has taken place so far.
Rosemary, Hollis, what is your view of what would happen if there is a big Israeli military response?
I think the war has moved on to a different scale. In a way, yesterday it went according to the Allied plan, and more so. There was much optimism about the way it was going. Now it's turning more towards what Saddam Hussein promised would happen if the war started. But it needn't be the all-out war that he talked about, nonetheless.
It needn't be?
No, it needn't be. Israel has been involved in the sense that Israel has been attacked. Israel could respond, but then it need not turn into an Arab-Israeli war, necessarily.
There is a danger, you think, of that, of other Arab countries in the coalition coming in against Israel at this stage?
Well, in a sense, there's pressures pulling in both directions. Saddam wants to turn it into a regional war, Arab-Israeli war, or Arab-Western and Israeli war, and at the same time, the coalition is working to contain it. So sending missiles to Israel and an Israeli response doesn't necessarily mean that the Allies have failed to do what they want to do.
David, can I say that the most immediate danger, I think, now is that Jordan might be dragged in? I think that's the next thing to guard against, because if Israel and Iraq are having goes at each other across Jordanian territory, it's very difficult to see how Jordan can isolate themselves from this.
Thank you, David. Let's go back to the newsroom and join Martyn Lewis.
And I can tell you that I've just been listening to a report from a reporter at Dhahran Air Base, and he has actually said that they were sent to the shelters at Dhahran Air Base, but they are now back up out of the shelters again. They went down to the shelters because the Saudi Arabian radar detected launches, the Saudi Arabian AWACS detected launches of Scud missiles which they believed could be coming towards Dhahran, but they were false alarms, and it seems that everyone is all right at Dhahran Air Base. Now we are going now, who are we going to now? We're going now to Mike Belkin in Tel Aviv, who is in a sealed room, I understand, in Tel Aviv. Mike, can you tell us, can you talk us through this attack from the beginning?
Yes, we were woken up by an air raid siren, and a few minutes later I heard 2 or 3 explosions, which sounded like conventional munitions. And we, my family and me, went into our pre-prepared sealed room and donned our gas masks, and that's it.
You donned your gas mask. What were you able to hear outside as you sat in your room? Were you able to hear any of the other missiles that we heard came in on Tel Aviv?
No, we heard only 2 or 3, and the question was a little confused by a thunderstorm. So some of the noises were actual thunder.
Mike, can you tell me what you and your family are going through as you go through this emergency procedure, as you become aware, as you are, that there has been a missile attack on Tel Aviv?
We are having quality time together. It's not often that we are all together. We are watching Monty Python cassettes on video.
Well, I did hear the Israelis had a sense of humor, but I did not think that you would take it that far. So, I mean, basically, you are in your sealed room, you have your gas masks on, and you, and one assumes that there may be many Israelis in Tel Aviv who would feel the same, are not particularly worried at this stage. Is that right?
Yes, I think that most people are remarkably unconcerned, because statistically, you can't get hurt. And,
right, Mike, thank you for joining us. We're going over to CNN Network. Well, no, we're not going to CNN. We're going, in fact, to Washington to Charles Wheeler. And Charles, can you tell me what the latest news is from Washington now, assuming that we've lost the gremlins and our lines are working?
Well, I'm still puzzled about the Pentagon, which is still talking about missiles. Have you had the breakdown of how many missiles landed where in Israel? Have you had that?
We only have what I gather is an NBC report on 8 missiles altogether.
3 in unpopulated areas, 1 in Haifa, 2 in Tel Aviv, and 1 unknown landing place. That doesn't add up to 8, it adds up to 7 for me. That's all we have from them. Now, I don't think the Pentagon has yet confirmed absolutely certainly that it's chemical. We've had all sorts of speculation coming into headphones about nerve gas and various other things, but as far as I'm concerned, this is still unconfirmed.
Charles, I can tell you what the source is for that. It is NBC, who are monitoring police radios in Tel Aviv, and they have reported that that 1 of the missiles had a chemical warhead.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm not contradicting what you're getting out of Tel Aviv. I'm merely pointing out that the Pentagon hasn't yet confirmed that it's chemical, and I think that may be significant because everybody here is getting in a dreadful panic. So, the Pentagon has yet to say whether it is chemical and what kind of chemical. It has
Charles,
quoted,
if it is not...
the Pentagon has... Go ahead.
Yeah, if it is not a chemical attack, do you think that lessens the temptation on the part of the Israelis to launch a retaliatory strike?
No, not for a second, but I think that it certainly lessens the sense of horror over here. Obviously, there are grave implications if Israel is being involved in the war, but what everybody is terrified of is gas, and we all know that, because if they're using gas on Israel, they'll presumably use gas on when the land war begins. So there are all kinds of... But leaving that aside for a minute, we are also hearing that Israel Radio has said, not only to people in Jerusalem, but also Tel Aviv, that they're to take their gas masks off. So the immediate danger of raids and missiles, sorry, I'm having trouble with this dreadful earpiece, appears to be receding.
Charles, can I ask you how public opinion in America will be reacting to the news of this attack on Israel?
Well, I mean, this is a really dreadful development. When you think that this comes the end of the day, when everybody's been trying to restrain their enthusiasm, the Pentagon, the White House have been begging people not to get their hopes high, warning them this is not going to be an easy war. But inevitably, with all these dreadful machines that have been built all these years, apparently working perfectly, people are enormously encouraged, and there has been a lot of speculation, and nobody can quite damp it down, that it might be only an air war, and the whole thing might be over by the weekend. Now, I don't think many people believe that, but I think there is a public perception that that's a possibility. Now, with this, I think everybody, in an hour or two in America, and everybody's glued to their television, it's only 8 or 9 in the evening, people are going to conclude that this really is going to be a long and very bloody war.
Charles, one extra piece of information we have here. Cable News Network are reporting the sound of explosions in Dhahran. Now, just a few moments ago, I was eavesdropping on one of their reporters who had come back from an air raid shelter, having gone down there an hour or so ago. He had emerged from the air raid shelter, and that same network is now reporting the sound of explosions in Dhahran. If that is true, and if Iraq is now launching its counterattack, as it were, first on Israel, then on Dhahran, how does this widen the war as you see it from Washington?
Well, it widens it because it brings in a country that is renowned for its ability to defend itself, which is not part of the coalition, and which to some extent obviously is independent of American control. As I was saying earlier, there's no way the Americans can stop the Israelis retaliating if that's what they want to do. And they've said several times that if they get hit, they're going to hit back. So I think there must be a terribly complicating factor in the Allied planning, quite apart from any effect it may have on the Arabs in the coalition. Now, one new thing, Pentagon sources, I've just had a message, say that 8 Scuds landed in Israel. They appear to have had conventional warheads. So the Pentagon is still not talking about chemical warheads.
Right, so that report that we had through NBC could well be wrong.
A lot of reports could well be wrong.
Charles,
these are the early stage. This is the very early stage of a war, and we're getting an awful lot of information that is quite clearly inaccurate as it comes in, and a lot more that proves to have been inaccurate after an hour or so. So I should be very careful with this, I think.
Charles Wheeler in Washington, thank you very much indeed. And I would like to go now, if I may, to Admiral Sir James Eberle, former Commander-in-Chief of Naval Home Command and a well-known tactician. Can I ask you, Sir James, how the Israelis could contemplate escalating a war, and I mean technically how they could contemplate escalating it when it appears there is an all-out onslaught going on in any case?
It's very difficult to see what extra they can do, but clearly there are a large number of targets in Iraq, and as a result of discussions that have been going on, I would imagine that there has been some agreement where if the Israelis had to strike back, this is the character of the targets that they would go for. And we've heard Phil Sabin earlier suggesting this evening that they might be the sort of economic targets, but they still would be targets whose destruction would impact upon the Iraqi people rather than upon the Iraqi armed forces and on Saddam Hussein.
There was earlier today what I think might safely be described as a certain feeling of euphoria abroad because it seemed that Iraq was not retaliating. That has been rudely interrupted tonight. Obviously, the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary, Tom King, and Dick Cheney and Marvin Fitzwater, they were all right when they said, don't count your chickens yet, that there is, you know, that there could be more to come. Do you think that the military planners foresee a scenario developing which could get quite messy, to put it bluntly?
Well, I think there are going to be additional military complexities in terms of coordinating the sort of Israeli strike that we must expect. But to a large extent, it will be the political complexities of the war. David Steele said just now that we've got to look very carefully at what the Jordanians might do. The Israelis, as I understand it, have declared a state of war with Iraq. Jordan lies between the two warring states. And there is, as we've also heard today, a great deal of support in Jordan for Saddam Hussein. It is these sort of complexities that are now added to the military planning. But the military planners would have known that this was a possibility, so I don't think we should try and second-guess what they're going to do, but this cannot be a total surprise.
Why do you think Saddam Hussein held back? Do you think that he was quite happy to accept the attack? Did he think it would perhaps be a first wave and then there would be a respite for 24 hours, say, and perhaps he didn't anticipate that it would go on as long as it has, the Allied onslaught, and therefore perhaps his attack on Israel was delayed for logistical military reasons rather longer than it might otherwise have been?
As long as he had the capability of launching this attack, as long as he was confident that these mobile missiles could be concealed, it didn't really matter to him whether there was a 12-hour delay or a 24-hour delay. And so whether it was due to a tactical decision by Saddam Hussein, whether it was due to the initial raid interrupting his military communications so he lost control, we shall not be sure, and it may have been all these things. But providing he could be confident that he could still carry out essentially a second strike, then he wasn't worried about the timing.
Well, Sir James, we heard earlier from our correspondent Michael McMillan in Jerusalem, a city, incidentally, which was not subject to a Scud missile attack. Michael, just a few moments ago, was interviewed by Cable News Network. We have that interview coming up now.
Well, Jerusalem's pretty quiet at the moment. Obviously, there's no traffic on the road whatsoever. I remind you about, what, 45 minutes ago, or I suppose it's about an hour ago now, we had the air raid siren. We were in the Hilton Hotel. We got out of there very quickly. Most people have been taken downstairs into the basement. And basically, I suppose there's been a degree of confusion and panic throughout Jerusalem.
And we go straight over to CNN's reporter in Dhahran, who is reporting an attack on that airbase.
Charles Jaco in Saudi Arabia here. There was just the sound of an explosion in the direction of the air base. We've been advised that this area is under threat of imminent attack any second. We should be prepared to go to the base or go to the shelters immediately. We're all preparing to get out. We hear sounds of something overhead, and there was a large explosion in the direction of the air base near here. As you can imagine, we're telling our people to get ready to get out of here and get to shelter as soon as they can.
Fold it and go. Charles Jaco, fold it up and go, and God bless you, and thank you for that report.
We're thinking about it right now. I think we should get it. Okay, guys, break it down. Out of here.
And I can tell you that Israel is apparently retaliating for the missile attack. That is CBS network in the United States, quoting United States officials. And according to Reuters, the United States is saying that Israel has the right to defend itself following the Israeli missile attack. We will, of course, bring you more news as we get it. For the moment, over to David Dimbleby.
Thank you, Martyn. There seems to be an obvious danger in circumstances like these of reports that are exaggerated coming in from all these networks, everybody trying to get their story through and not double-checking and triple-checking them. And it seems from what we're hearing now that it may not be true that there was a chemical attack on Israel. We don't know. It may not be true that there's an attack on Dahran. There's one reporter standing there saying he can hear a noise over his head. I don't say this to diminish what they're saying, but just to say that sometimes in these circumstances, television adds to the drama perhaps too much, and we should be rather cautious about the way things are developing. At least that's how I see it. And it's very easy to get panicked listening to these instant reports coming in from all over the world. As Charles Wheeler was saying, the Pentagon refused to say that there had been any chemical weapons used against Israel. And that, of course, changes things somewhat. Wouldn't you say, if it's not a chemical attack, that Israel may perhaps not feel it has to respond with quite the same scale, though we hear a report that the Pentagon has said they expect them now to retaliate, but it may not be something on the same scale as we were talking about half an hour ago.
I would agree with that. There's a definite difference of perception between conventional attack, we're talking of half a ton of conventional explosive, if that, on these missiles, and between that and weapons of mass destruction. There's a great deal of difference of perception in terms of what level of retaliation the Israelis would require. I would expect, in the face of conventional attack, for the Israelis to fairly closely parallel the Allied pattern of attacks, namely sticking very carefully to military targets, although I don't think they have the scale of the precision munitions. They have a number of them, but not widespread enough.
Is there, Rosemary Hollis, as an expert in Middle East affairs and in the way that the Arab coalition has been put together and the countries that support Saddam Hussein, how they've got together, is there a danger of any other Arab countries being brought into this? Do you think Jordan, for instance, might be brought in if, in any way over the next 2 or 3 days?
Well, I suppose the immediate question that arises is that if Israel retaliates against Iraq and crosses Jordanian airspace, what do the Jordanians do about it? If they try to stop the Israelis have intimated that they can expect to have their air force obliterated. On the other hand, if they don't try to stop the Israelis and sit there and take it, there may be some political repercussions inside Jordan for the government there.
Dr. Sabin, what capacity would Jordan have to do anything if Israel does, as they have to reach Iraq, overfly Jordan?
Israel has done it before when it attacked the Tuwaitha nuclear plant outside Baghdad in 1981. The difference between then and now is that then it was a situation of piping peace with the Jordanian Air Force and Air Defense not on alert. Now, obviously, they're on the very highest stage of alert. I would still expect, however, the Israeli Air Force to be able to get through to Iraq without too much of a problem.
Would King Hussein be under pressure to do something if Israel did overfly? Because he must be terrified that that tiny country, not very well defended, will be simply wiped out, crushed, if there is a bigger battlefield in the Middle East.
He will certainly be under pressure to do whatever he can with his military forces to stop the Israelis, and it might be better for him if one of the Israeli planes were shot down of the group that they sent. Of course, the Israelis may decide to retaliate with Jericho missiles, and the speed with which this retaliation seems to be occurring may suggest that that's what's happening. And of course, Jordan can do nothing at all about that, any more than it could do about the Scuds coming over the other way.
David Steele, do you see an enlargement of the crisis and an enlargement of the war now in view of what you've been hearing as inevitable?
Well, I'd like not to think it's inevitable, but I certainly think that there's a severe risk. I think the last speaker was correct that if it's missiles that are being exchanged, then Jordan can perhaps still stay out of it. But I know Crown Prince Hassan was saying only last week that if the Iraqis sent in aircraft or anything over their territory, they would try to resist that. I think his Prime Minister, in fact, in a rather peculiar statement while I was there, said that they would only come in if they were invited. which is a very strange concept with Saddam Hussein, I'd have thought. And as far as Israel's concerned, there is the constant risk that the thing will flare up between the two air forces, and the Israelis have by far the superior one.
George Robertson.
Well, I would underscore what you said at the beginning, David. I think that if you can imagine the impact that these rumours broadcast right round the world of a chemical weapons attack must have had inside Israel as a whole, you begin to see, in a way, a slightly pernicious influence that this round-the-clock television can have. Now, we're part of it here, and we're starting to speculate on the basis of these germs of information. Obviously, we could be into a new dimension of the war. But I come back to the hope, and maybe it's a futile hope, but it is still a genuine hope that in 5 months of planning, with the coordination that all these countries did during that, all the intelligence gathering, all the game planning that must have been done, surely people cannot be walking blindly into a situation whereby we are engulfed by all these new complexities that would be called for here, and that some of the factors that went into the planning of what was clearly quite a surgical raid last night must be going into whatever is being planned in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem from now on.
And of course, we don't know what's actually happening tonight from the American and Allied forces' point of view in the way of attacks on Baghdad and the rest. Winston Churchill, you were going to say something?
Well, I think we do know that there have been further cruise missile attacks in and around Baghdad, and there have been reports of the B-52s making major raids on armoured concentrations in Kuwait and also Iraq. But I think there's no question but that the Israelis, if they were to strike back, if they are striking back, it would put enormous pressure on the alliance. But I do agree with David Steele when he says that there's every chance that in spite of that, the alliance will hold together.
Thank you, Winston Churchill. Let's go back now to the newsroom and rejoin Martyn Lewis.
And CBS are reporting that both the Pentagon and Israeli radio have confirmed that there has been an Israeli counterattack on Iraq. No information on what their targets were or how successful that attack was. Israeli radio is reporting casualties in the missile attack. And we understand that there are fresh explosions in Tel Aviv. That is according to the cable news network. Those fresh explosions would come after the 7 or 8, which the Pentagon believes have conventional, not chemical warheads, but they do say at the same time that they cannot yet rule out a chemical attack. Defense sources in Washington say that sirens, air raid sirens, are wailing all across Dhahran. We have no further information at this stage on whether there actually is an incoming missile attack to Dhahran Air Base. Although we do understand that we're going to Michael McMillan in Jerusalem for the very latest from Israel. Michael, what news?
The news we can give you here, Martyn, they're clamping down as far as us being able to refer to the number of missile attacks and exactly where those have taken place. The censor has told us that we cannot give those details at the moment. What I can tell you is that here in Jerusalem we have been told in the past half hour that we can take a gas mask off, that the state of alert seems to have been reduced somewhat. Also, I can tell you that happened in Tel Aviv about an hour ago, and then everybody, of course, was told to put them back on again. So the state of alert remains the same here. There have been no more air raid sirens. The last air raid siren was about an hour ago, but of course I've talked to you on numerous occasions since then. And as I said, no damage report, no indication of the number of injuries, and of course no indication of what the Israeli Air Force is going to do now. What I can tell you is that I've seen or heard, of course it's pitch black here, I've heard that jets in the sky over Jerusalem in the past 10-15 minutes. But as I said, we have no indication of whether or not the Israelis have got involved in any reaction, any military reaction to these attacks.
Well, Michael, for your information, CBS is quoting US officials as saying that Israel is apparently retaliating for the missile attack. So perhaps that was the jets that you were hearing in the sky. Can I also tell you that Cable News Network are reporting fresh explosions in Tel Aviv? Have you any more information you could give us on that? You said a moment ago that you didn't think that there were any further attacks after the initial after the initial Scud missiles?
I don't think that there have been any more attacks in Tel Aviv, Martyn, because, I mean, about 5 or 10 minutes ago I heard that everyone in Tel Aviv was being told that they could take their gas mask on, or could take their gas mask off, should I say. But, you know, this thing is changing minute by minute, and we really don't know what's going to happen next.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to you if there is any more news. And although Michael said that Israeli military sources were unable to allow him to say where the attacks were in Israel, defense sources in Washington have said very clearly that 2 missiles hit Tel Aviv, 2 missiles hit Haifa, 3 fell in rural districts, and 1 is unspecified. They're not sure where it came down, but we had one earlier report that it might have fallen on open land somewhere. There is some discrepancy in the figures as to whether it is 7 or 8, but as David Dimbleby reminded us just a few minutes ago, there are so many reports coming in from so many different directions, from so many sources, that what you are seeing here on BBC One is an attempt to pull together all those different sources. One of the major sources for the information is Cable News Network of America, and we're going to go over to them, reporting live now from Saudi Arabia.
With this latest development this evening. David?
All right, thank you very much, Wolf Blitzer at the Pentagon. Once again tonight there have been some missiles incoming to Israel, Scud missiles from Iraq, and Allied forces are responding to that happenstance tonight. And also they're preparing Israelis to stand by their shelters, and our people, as you could see in the Jerusalem Bureau, have their gas masks handy, off and on when ordered. So James Blackwell, again from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Would Saddam Hussein, if he had only 8 candles left, light them off? Wouldn't it be committing suicide?
If he had only 8 candles left, then the only utility they have, so few missiles, would be to strike terror in the hearts of someone else and try to widen the war. The really relevant military targets for Saddam Hussein are Dhahran and King Khalid City and the other concentrations that he would have some utility for. Instead, it looks, at least right now, as if this attack was launched at Israel. That seems to indicate to me an act of desperation. And what we saw in Israel tonight so far, as I said when we began this broadcast, was the fog of war in action. I think you've captured it probably for the first time in history. When the situation's confused and people are seeking to find out what to do, there's really no time to try to assess the situation and figure it out on your own. You fall back on your training. We saw the Israeli people and the Israeli government react in accordance with their drills and their instructions. They're quite accustomed to doing that. At the same time, we saw the airplanes scrambling and getting aloft. And just as Wolf pointed out, the fact that Saddam launched those missiles reveals their locations. I'll guarantee you that with the sensors that are aloft, it is known now exactly where they are, and it's likely that very soon, if not already, they've been destroyed.
Since some of them are mobile, is there a possibility, you know, the U.S. forces, the Allied forces, have assiduously tried to avoid religious sites of supreme significance to the Arab culture. As we had live reporting last night and early this morning and into the morning from our 3 correspondents, they could report that shrines and other things were being left alone. Could that be where they're coming from?
It's not very likely. A Scud launching site is not a very small thing. It's several hundred square meters by the time you put all the things you've got to put together to launch a Scud missile: fuel, electrical generating equipment, the truck itself, and the missiles. Now, it can be moved rapidly. It's not easy to hide it inside something like a mosque. Now, let's remember what's going on the Allied side here. Airplanes are conducting their sorties into Iraq. It's extremely likely that once these launches were detected, some of those raids were diverted, particularly the manned penetrating bomber and fighter bomber aircraft that are capable of quickly changing their mission, being vectored to a new target and dropping their ordnance with very great precision. I would imagine that F-15Es F-117A stealth fighters, which have this capability where if they were aloft, were likely vectored over to these mobile launcher sites. And even if they've moved since they made their launches, those kinds of aircraft have some capability to find those relocatable targets and perhaps to destroy them.
Once again, we've had reports. The best report we've had was that no more than 12 missiles had been launched from Iraq into the area of Israel, and we still don't have confirmation that any of them had any toxic materials aboard. But it's a very, very tense night in this world as Operation Desert Storm continues with all its thunder. For now, I'm David French in Washington, going back to Atlanta, and my colleague Catherine Cryer.
Thank you, David. The Turkish cabinet tonight ordered the general staff to allow foreign forces to utilize Turkish air bases in the southern portion of that country. Our stringer in Turkey is now standing by. Can you tell us anything about the use of U.S. planes and military there in the southern portion of the nation?
Yes, and what I can tell you about Turkey, as it happens, is that according to AFP, 28 United States planes, jets, have taken off from the air base there starting late on Thursday. That's a report from correspondents on the spot. The plane started taking off at 11 GMT. But let's leave Turkey for the moment. I'd like to, first of all, give you an update, as it were, on where we stand at the moment, because, as we say, there is much confusing information coming in. I'd like to talk to you, Sir James, if I may, in just a moment about that. But before we do, a quick recap on where we stand at the moment, what we know for certain at the moment. Iraq has launched a Scud missile attack against Israel. An Israeli army spokesman has confirmed that Israel has been under missile attack from Iraq. Israeli radio has reported that there have been casualties. There are reports of as many as 10 explosions having been heard in Tel Aviv, and according to NBC, nerve gas has been identified in a Tel Aviv suburb. And I'm sorry, we're actually, I'm withdrawing that, because in the great confusion of information that we have around here, I have a piece of paper in front of me which I thought was the summing up, as it were. It had the right number to be the summing up, and in fact it is not correct. It is an earlier sheet of paper. That is a measure of the way in which information is coming in and changing all the time. What I can tell you, and this is for sure, is that explosions have also been heard near the air base at Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. Saddam Hussein had warned before the Allied onslaught that Israel would be attacked by Iraqi forces if there was a war in the Gulf. CBS News has said that missiles had hit Israel in Tel Aviv, in the northern port of Haifa, and in the Galilee town of Safed. They later reported that Israel had counterattacked, but we have no confirmation of that. According to NBC, nerve gas has been identified in a Tel Aviv suburb. That, as I say, is only from NBC, and there is no confirmation of that. In fact, the Pentagon has not confirmed any reports of chemical weapons being used. Just to clarify that, because there was some confusion over what the Pentagon was saying over the last hour and a half or so. In Washington, a Pentagon spokesman did confirm that there had been Scud rocket attacks against Israel. That is certain. The American news agency, CBS, said Saudi officials have reported that Iraqi rockets have also been fired at Saudi Arabia. We know no more than that. Sir James, I talked a moment ago about the great confusion of information that is coming in here. If it is like this for us, trying to report these dramatic developments in the Middle East, what is it like for the military commanders who are actually involved in taking action on the basis of that information? Is it as confusing for them as it is for us?
Martyn, I think what we're seeing tonight is what military commanders have been used to for a long time. In war, one has a mass of information. Much of it is confusing, much of it is contradictory. And military commanders are used trying to have to sort that so that they can base their actions. Because of the miracles of modern communications and technology, we are now able to do this around the world. And as a number of people have said tonight, we have to be very careful at not giving interpretations which would give alarm unnecessarily. But we undoubtedly are tonight facing a very confused but a very serious situation.
And when the commanders sit down and take decisions on what they do now, might they have to abandon certain game plans because, for example, a squadron of fighter bombers were due to take off from, say, Dhahran Air Base? Now, if, you know, we've heard of the alert there, if there is any kind of an alert there, does that set the plan back? Do they have to change the plan, not just at Dhahran, but the whole plan for continuing the attack against Iraq?
One tries to build in flexibility in any plan so that one can take account of unexpected events. And undoubtedly the air plan would have allowed a certain amount of flexibility, but modern sorties do require immense amount of planning, and just to divert a sortie, even with modern technology, against a new target is quite difficult.
Because some of their weapons would have been primed to automatically home in on that particular target before they left the airbase.
The weapons may not be suitable to the new target, the exact location may not be there, there may be interference with other flights coming to attack other targets. There are immense complexities to the coordination of these sorts of air attacks.
But under certain circumstances, would it be possible to turn around a squadron of fighter bombers in the air and bring them back, even though their missiles were armed and ready for attack, or would they have to fire their missiles?
No,
first?
they could certainly be brought back, and as we've heard that the 20% of sorties in the first wave that didn't reach their targets, a number of them were recalled because they couldn't identify their military targets, and rather than risking using their weapons and causing unnecessary civilian casualties, they did return to base.
What do you think would be going through the minds of the commanders now of the Allied operation as they hear about these attacks coming in, and how would they be consulting with Washington, and where would the decisions be taken?
I think I would draw a parallel with the Falkland Islands War, and I was closely concerned with that. And it was when the Sheffield was hit and later sunk that one really realized that we had a severe fight on our hands. And I think that is what would be going through the minds of most of the military commanders. They knew that it was likely to happen, and here we've now got a real fight on our hands.
You feel that this is a catalyst? What is happening tonight with this Scud attack on Israel is the same kind of catalyst as the Sheffield was for us in the Falklands?
I think that is so. War is always horrific. You hope that it may not be. Here is part of the horrifying nature of modern war.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir James. And I understand that we now have a report from Tim Sebastian in Washington coming up now.
These are pictures received here from Israel just a few moments ago, showing journalists and technicians at the offices of Cable News Network. Iraqi Scud missiles had already hit targets in Tel Aviv and Haifa, and an American expert was advising the journalists how to react to further attacks.
It's extremely important that all the people there do exactly as the Israeli government has instructed them to do. They must put their masks on now. I'm looking at this monitor. I see windows open. They must be closed. The people must put their gas masks on. If these missiles have nerve agents, by the time they realize that they are being gassed, it's too late. The nerve agents work in a matter of seconds, and it's extremely important, as I've observed all the networks here this evening in this 1 hour of this gas attack, that they follow instructions to the letter.
There's so far no statement from the White House, but U.S. officials are calling the missile attack major and saying it could drastically alter the course of the war. Officials are not optimistic that they can persuade Israel to stay out of the conflict. In any case, America had promised massive retaliation in the event of chemical attack, a promise restated tonight.
This is one time I hope they'll let us do the retaliating for them. They know now that we have hit Iraq very hard. They know our capabilities. We've had very good coordination with them. The relationship is excellent. So I am hopeful they'll let us do the responding, and we will not see the war spread.
Unconfirmed reports from Dhahran in Saudi Arabia spoke of a further Iraqi missile attack there. At any rate, reporters and technicians heeded urgent warnings.
There was just the sound of an explosion in the direction of the air base. We've been advised that this area is under threat of imminent attack any second. We should be prepared to go to the base or go to the shelters immediately. We're all preparing to get out. We hear sounds of something overhead, and there was a large explosion in the direction of the air base near here. As you can imagine, we're telling our people to get ready to get out of here and get to shelter as soon as they can.
Fold it and go. Charles Jaco, fold it up and go, and God bless you, and thank you for that report.
We're thinking about it right now. I think we should get... Okay, guys, break it down. Out of here.
Here in Washington, U.S. officials confirm 8 Scud missiles reached Israeli targets. There are no accurate reports yet of casualties. The Israelis, we're told, can respond with similar Jericho missiles, and reports in the last few minutes say that retaliation has already begun. Tim Sebastian, BBC News, Washington.
And Reuters is reporting that a French television reporter speaking live from Dhahran in Saudi Arabia said he had heard 3 loud explosions from the direction of the airport as an air raid warning was sounded in the city early on Friday. Here at home, we know that Mr. Major, the Prime Minister, is now in consultation with the Americans and the Israelis, according to a Number 10 spokesman. Michael McMillan has just come on the line from Jerusalem. Michael, can you tell us any more about what is happening, in particular these reports that we've had now about there not being a chemical attack on Tel Aviv?
Martyn, I can't confirm that. I mean, reports are still very confused. I mean, we hear some contacts from Tel Aviv say that nerve gases have been detected. Some say they haven't. So it's impossible to say at this stage. The censor here is clamping down very firmly on what exactly we can say, the number of missile attacks, and exactly where they have taken place. So still an enormous degree of confusion here, Martyn, and probably some hours yet before we know exactly what's going on. I should say that the alert seems to have decreased somewhat in Jerusalem. There have been no missile strikes around here, and we have been told that we can take our gas masks off. The streets of Jerusalem at the moment are deserted, obviously, and the state of alert remains exactly the same. And really, as I said, we'll be waiting for more news from Tel Aviv over the next couple of hours, but no information yet also about whether or not the Israelis have started to embark on any retaliatory attack. What I can tell you is that over the past half hour I have heard Israeli jets in the sky above Jerusalem. We don't know what they're doing, where they're going. But the Israeli Air Forces, obviously, should I say, Israeli aircraft have taken off, and a substantial number are flying around Jerusalem now.
Michael, and I don't know whether this is subject to your military censorship or not, but we have a Jordanian official reporting intense mobilization of the Israeli Air Force.
Well, the Israeli Air Force has been on permanent standby for the past week, and most of Israel's, 700, 750 planes are in the sky. There can be no doubt that the number of jets that we're hearing in the sky has increased substantially over the past 2 hours, and you can speculate what's going on. I would think that Israel is going to be involved in some sort of retaliation. Remember what it said repeatedly: if Iraq attacks, we will respond in kind, and we will know how to respond. There was, of course, the argument of a measured response, or perhaps no response at all, to maybe 1 or 2 missiles. That has not been the case. We know it's been a substantial attack in Tel Aviv, and one presumes now that the Israeli Air Force is in the process of embarking on some sort of attack upon Iraq.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. We'll come back to you for any more news as it comes in. And we are now going over live to Downing Street, where Martyn Dowle has some news on, perhaps on those consultations that the Prime Minister has been having with the Americans and the Israelis. Martyn Dowle.
Yes, Martyn, the latest word here is that the Prime Minister has put out a statement saying that he is appalled by this unprovoked and unforgivable attack. Now, I understand that he hasn't talked himself directly to President Bush, but as you know, the hotline here is permanently open, and there have been contacts with American and Israeli officials, so that's been done at official level rather than directly from Prime Minister to President. you will remember that in the House of Commons this afternoon, Mr. Major was asked about the possibility of an Iraqi attack on Israel, and he said that that would justify a serious and severe response from the Allies. And of course, before that, he had said that it would be justifiable for Israel to counterattack if it was attacked by Iraq. We're told by officials here that Mr. Major is being kept fully informed on the situation, and that's the latest news we have here.
And Martyn, the Prime Minister was obviously right when he urged a certain amount of caution this afternoon about those early reports that were coming in, which some people were perhaps getting rather euphoric about, feeling that a victory was in sight. And now, of course, it looks as though there has been, well, we have all got to retrench on that particular position in view of what has happened tonight.
Yes, absolutely. We were told much earlier in the day, after one had seen headlines saying things like 100% success and so on, that the attacks, although they had obviously been massive, there was no way of knowing whether they were complete or not. And of course, the War Cabinet will meet around about 9:30 later today to assess the extent of the damage. And of course, they were making perfectly clear that they didn't know how complete the damage had been, that they were aware that the Iraqis had the capacity to regroup, and of course this has now happened.
Martyn, Dowle in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed. And we just have a flash from Reuters saying that Israeli radio is reporting that there are no casualties from the missile attacks. I repeat, Reuters reporting Israeli radio as saying that there are no casualties from these missile attacks. The situation is confused and changing all the time. We will come back to it when we can. In the meantime, over to David Dimbleby.
Thank you, Martyn. Well, no casualties, I suppose, could mean no retaliation. We began earlier this evening talking about the peace conference that would follow this war if it was successfully prosecuted against Saddam Hussein, and of the need for, at the heart of it, an Israeli-Arab agreement of some sort, or a peace conference that was supported, some people were saying, by the Europeans as opposed to the Americans, to give it a chance. Since we've been on the air, we've heard this news that Israel has been tempted into this war by a deliberate attack from Iraq of Scud missiles. And I suppose the thing we might end on here in this studio is how this will affect what we were saying earlier on, and what your view is of the impact of Israel being drawn in on the possibilities of a long-term peace. I'd like to start first, because he's not here but up in Edinburgh, with David Steele. Sir David.
Well, I'm now totally confused. I don't know about your viewers, but as we've had so many conflicting reports, I'm beginning to wonder what we're all doing here, sitting commenting on these different reports. I mean, one minute there are no casualties, another minute there's a building collapse in Tel Aviv, there's either chemical or not chemical weapons. I mean, which of those suppositions would you like me to choose? It really has become an almost ridiculous exercise, this, and I think that all we can say is now, for goodness sake, let's leave it to the military. John Major, I think, has come out of this, if I may say so, extremely well, because both in the House of Commons this afternoon and in his well-judged broadcast tonight, he cautioned against over-optimism. And, of course, this scenario of Israel being brought in has been the one that we've been dreading all the way through. But it's much too early in the middle of the night to come to any hard and fast conclusions based on all these conflicting reports. I'm sorry, I can't do better than that.
Well, I rather agree with you. I remember Tolstoy's description in War and Peace of the Battle of Borodino, wasn't it, when nobody knew what was happening for a long time and everybody had different versions.
Yeah.
Winston Churchill.
I think we may have been pursuing a red herring around the globe on this one, because these weapons, these Scuds, clearly they were launched, clearly they struck Israel, but they are vastly inaccurate. They have an accuracy certainly of no better than 10 miles, and there are vast areas, even in the suburbs of Tel Aviv, where they can land without doing any damage. And if indeed that is an accurate report, that there's been no Israeli casualty, I would be very skeptical about the idea of an Israeli retaliation using Jericho missiles or a massive all-out air attack. And I would have thought under those circumstances one could expect the Israelis to be restraining themselves, and I would hope that the Allied commanders, while making a special effort to identify and locate and knock out the Scud launchers, would very calmly and deliberately carry through with the meticulously planned Desert Storm battle plan, and that they will stick to their concept of concentrating solely on military targets and excluding to the maximum any possibility of civilian casualties.
George Robertson?
David, I just deeply hope that the people who are in charge of the military operation have got better intelligence and better information on which to make their judgments. It's in a way laughable, but it's not a frivolous point. I think that a lot of these rumours that are now flying around the world can have implications in themselves. There is little doubt at all the panic in Israel there must have been at the thought of nerve agents, people being taken to hospitals, must have been great indeed. I just hope that this underlines the fact that at the very beginning everybody said that if there was going to be a military conflict, it was going to be nasty, it could be brutal, it is certainly going to be complex. There's nothing neat about this conflict. Maybe no conflict, but certainly not one in the Middle East, and we must desperately hope that the people in charge of the campaign know what they're doing, have planned it in advance, and that there will be a sensible outcome.
Philip Sabin, the rule of journalism is at least 2 sources before you believe anything, but I suppose if you're in a position of the Israeli Air Force, for instance, or the cabinet or the war cabinet there, it is very difficult. If you get it wrong, it may be too late.
That's true, but I think the lesson of tonight for the Israeli decision makers is they can afford to wait. They're not in a use-it-or-lose-it situation where their own air force is under threat or their own Jericho missiles. And I hope they haven't launched retaliation before they know exactly what has happened or what has not happened. And I was very worried by the speed with which retaliation seemed to be suggested, and I just hope that they have taken the lesson more to heart than perhaps some of us have.
Well, that's something that we shall discover later on. Dr. Hollis?
I think what seems to have happened tonight is in keeping with what was predicted as quite possible. And as the war progresses, it is to be expected that various incidents occur on the sidelines and in between the headlines, and we won't know the full story.
Well, thank you all very much here. Thank you, Sir David Steele, for joining us from Edinburgh. Let's go back now and rejoin Martyn Lewis in the newsroom.
And a summary of the position in the Gulf War tonight. Iraq has launched a missile attack against Israel. An Israeli army spokesman has confirmed that Israel has been under missile attack from Iraq. Our correspondent in Washington said that according to the Pentagon, Israel was going to retaliate. It's now thought that there have been as many as 8 explosions in Israel. Explosions have also been heard near the airbase at Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. Saddam Hussein had warned before the Allied onslaught that Israel would be attacked by Iraqi forces if there was a war in the Gulf. 2 missiles have landed in Tel Aviv, 2 near the northern port of Haifa, 3 in unpopulated areas, and another in an unspecified place. The Prime Minister, John Major, is said to be appalled by these unprovoked and unforgivable attacks on Israel. Mr. Major is now in consultation with the Americans and the Israelis. We will have more details throughout the night on CFAX, and there will be hourly bulletins on Radio 2. Breakfast news on BBC One will be at 6 o'clock with a full update of the night's developments. But that is the news in the Gulf War tonight. Good night.
And we close BBC One tonight with a look at the weather. Some northern and eastern areas may be bright for a while after the clearance of any early morning frost and fog. Otherwise, the whole country will be generally cloudy. After a little rain in the south at first, more persistent rain will reach the southwest during the morning and extend to all areas except northeast Scotland by early evening. Some of this rain will be rather heavy before clearer weather reaches the far southwest by dusk. It will gradually turn milder and become rather windy too, especially in the west. And that's the weather. Time now 18 minutes past 2. And here on BBC One, after those pages from CFAX in a few moments, breakfast news will be on the air at 6 o'clock in the morning, just a reminder. For the moment, we wish you a very good night.